Hey, welcome back, friend. If you're settling in right now, maybe pulling the covers up, maybe lying in the dark with just the quiet hum of the night around you, then you have found exactly the right place to be. Tonight we're going to travel back together, not to a battlefield, not to a palace full of drama. We're going somewhere perhaps even more interesting than that. We're going to the ordinary world, the everyday world, the world of people who woke up in the morning, worked with their hands, and then eventually went to sleep. But here is the thing, the way they worked was nothing like what you do today. The way they rested would surprise you. And the moment everything changed, the moment someone looked at a working person and said, "You do not own your time anymore," that moment reshaped human life more profoundly than almost any war, any invention, any revolution in history. And most of us have never stopped to think about it. So tonight we will. Before you drift off with me into this story, if something tonight moves you, makes you curious, or just gives you that warm feeling of having learnt something quietly wonderful, please take a moment to hit that like button and maybe leave a little comment below. Even just tell me where in the world you're watching this from or what time it is for you right now. Those small things genuinely mean everything to me, and if you want more nights like this, one subscribing would make me very happy. Now dim whatever light is still on, find your most comfortable position, and let us begin. Let us go back. Not to the 1800s yet. Not quite. Let us go to the world just before it, the world that the 1800s were about to erase. Imagine a village somewhere in rural England, or France, or the rolling farmlands of Pennsylvania. It is the year 1750, give or take a few decades. The sun rises, a farmer opens his eyes not because an alarm rang, not because a factory whistle screamed, but because the light coming through the window simply told him it was time. He stretches. Maybe he looks outside to check the sky. Is it a good day for ploughing, or does the colour of the clouds suggest rain by afternoon? There is no boss waiting, no clock on the wall demanding he be somewhere at a precise minute. His schedule, if you could even call it that, was written not by any man but by the season, the weather, and the land beneath his feet. This is hard for us to truly imagine today. We live in a world so ruled by time, by meetings at 9, by deadlines, by the little notification that tells you your lunch break ends in 3 minutes, that the idea of a life without that invisible pressure feels almost fictional. But for most of human history, work did not look the way it does now. And understanding the older world, really understanding it, is the only way to understand what the 1800s did to ordinary people. Because what happened in that century was not just an economic revolution. It was a revolution in time itself. Here is something that historians have found quietly extraordinary. Before the Industrial Revolution, workers in England observed something called St. Monday. Now, St. Monday was not a real religious holiday. There was no St. Monday in any church calendar. But craftsmen, cobblers, weavers, tailors, blacksmiths had invented it anyway. The logic was beautifully human. Sunday was the official day of rest. But Sunday was also the day people went to church, visited family, stayed up late talking and drinking and living their lives. By the time Monday morning came around, many craftsmen were tired or still celebrating, or simply not ready to work, and so they did not. They took Monday off too, informally, collectively, as if by unspoken agreement across entire trades and towns. One French historian writing about the 18th century described craftsmen in Paris who would simply walk out of their workshops on Monday mornings and head to the nearest tavern, not out of laziness, but out of a deep sense that their time belonged to them. Employers complained endlessly about St. Monday. Managers wrote furious letters. Economists wrote concerned essays about the loss of productivity. But the workers continued for generations. Because in that older world there was a fundamental assumption baked into daily life, an assumption so obvious that nobody even spoke it aloud. The assumption was this: a working person owns their own time. You decide when to start. You decide when to stop. You work hard when the work demands it during planting season, during harvest, during a rush of orders, and you rest when the natural rhythm of life allows it. This was not laziness. This was simply the human relationship with time that had existed more or less for centuries. Let us paint a fuller picture, because the pre-industrial world was far more layered than the simple image of a farmer tending fields. In the cities of Europe, in London, in Paris, in Amsterdam, there were craftsmen of every description. Shoemakers, glass blowers, carpenters, silk weavers, clockmakers, bakers, goldsmiths. These were skilled people, often trained for years through an apprenticeship system. A young man might spend 7 years learning a trade before he was allowed to call himself a journeyman. And a journeyman, once qualified, had something precious mastery over his own work. He decided the pace. He decided the quality. He often worked in a small shop attached to the back of a house, with the windows open in summer and the fire going in winter. Historian records from early 18th century London show something that would astonish. A modern manager, journeyman regularly took breaks to drink ale during the workday. Not at a designated break room, just whenever they felt like it. Sometimes one man would read the newspaper aloud while others kept their hands busy, a kind of multitasking that sounds honestly rather pleasant. Work stopped when it was too dark to see. Nobody tracked the hours with a stopwatch. And here is a detail that I find almost impossible to believe until I see the historical records in 17th century Paris. Craftspeople enjoyed up to 103 official holidays per year. In parts of northern Italy in the 16th century, the figure was around 95, including Sundays, nearly a third of the entire year. Now, life was still hard. Winters could be brutal. Illness could sweep through a family and destroy everything. There was no social safety net in any modern sense. Pre-industrial poverty was real and grinding. But within all of that hardship, there was something that the coming century would slowly, methodically take away. There was breathing room. The rhythm of the agricultural year had its own profound logic. Spring intense planting. Everyone worked long days because the soil waited for no one. Summer tending, watching, mending fences, caring for animals. Autumn, the great harvest. Some of the most exhausting weeks of the year, but also the most communal, the most festive. Entire villages worked side by side in the fields, and harvest end was marked by celebration. And then winter. Winter in the pre-industrial world was something close to enforced rest. Historical construction records from England show that building projects essentially paused between January and February. The roads were too difficult. The light was too weak. The ground was often frozen. People turned inward. They made things by hand at home, spinning, weaving, repairing tools. They told stories around fires. They slept longer hours because the dark nights were simply longer. A proverb from the English countryside captured it perfectly. Candlemas Day, put beans in the clay, put candles and candlesticks away. Candlemas is the 2nd of February. The proverb was a kind of collective exhale, a signal that the dark stillness of January was finally over and it was time to begin again. Work breathed in and out with the year. The historian E.P. Thompson, one of the great scholars of working-class life, described this beautifully. He called it task orientation, meaning that work was organized around what needed to be done, not around an abstract quantity of hours. You worked until the task was finished, then you stopped. And if the task was not yet needed, if the seeds did not need planting, if the orders had not yet arrived, then you rested. Not because someone gave you permission to rest, simply because rest was woven into the fabric of ordinary life. Now, I want you to hold all of that in your mind for a moment. The unhurried craftsman with his St. Monday, the harvest celebration that marked the turning of the year, the winter quiet that gave families time to simply be together, the journeyman in his small shop reading aloud from a newspaper while his hands worked. Hold that image, because something was coming, something that had never existed before in human history. It was a building long, low, brick-walled with small windows set high and a chimney rising into the grey sky. Inside that building, machines were being assembled. Machines powered not by human muscles or horse or wind or water, but by something new, steam. And those machines needed workers, not skilled craftsmen with years of training who would wander off on St. Monday and set their own pace. These machines needed bodies, obedient, punctual, interchangeable bodies. Bodies that would arrive at a fixed hour, stand at a fixed station, perform a fixed motion again and again and again for 12 hours straight. And for the first time in human history, someone was going to tell an ordinary working person, "Your time is not yours anymore. It belongs to me, and I will tell you exactly when it begins." Coming up next, we're going to walk inside that factory. We're going to feel the heat, hear the machines, and understand what it truly meant when the world shifted from the rhythm of seasons to the tyranny of the clock. Stay with me. There is a sound I want you to imagine, not a gentle sound, not something you could sleep through. It is a bell, or sometimes later in the century a steam whistle, and it erupts into the darkness at 4:30 in the morning, before sunrise, before birds, before any sane person would choose to be awake. And somewhere in Manchester in the year 1830, a man jolts out of a shallow sleep on a straw mattress. His body aches, his lungs hurt, they always hurt now from the cotton dust. He has maybe 10 minutes to dress, splash cold water on his face and get out the door. Because if he is late, he will be fined. Not warned, not gently reminded, fined. Money taken directly from wages that were already barely enough to live on. And if he is late, 5 minutes, not an hour, not half a day, 5 minutes, that fine could equal a full hour of work. Gone. Just like that. Welcome to the factory. Welcome to the world that replaced the one we left behind. Now I need to pause here for a second because I think there is something we miss when we read about the Industrial Revolution in a history book. We read the numbers, 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, dangerous conditions, and we understand them intellectually. We think, how terrible. We nod, and then we move on. But what those numbers cannot quite capture is what it felt like psychologically to live through this change if you had been born into the older world. Imagine you are a handloom weaver in England in 1800. You have spent your entire life working at your own pace, in your own cottage, setting your own hours. Yes, life is hard. Yes, you are poor. But you decide when you start. You decide when you stop. You take a walk in the afternoon if the light is good and the mood strikes you. And then almost within a single generation, everything that felt normal about your working life is declared obsolete. Now there is a building. A massive brick building with small windows set high in the wall so you cannot see outside. Inside the air is thick with lint and heat from the steam engines. The noise, and I cannot stress this enough, the noise is so overwhelming that workers in the weaving rooms of Victorian Manchester began losing their hearing within years. Not decades. Years. One man who worked in a Dundee mill as a boy writing his memoir in 1850 remembered how the factory managers handled time. They would move the clocks forward in the morning to make workers appear late and move them back in the evening to extend the shift. They manipulated time itself literally, physically, with their hands on clock faces to squeeze more hours out of the people who could not afford to argue. Think about that for a moment. The very instrument that was now supposed to govern your life, the clock, was being quietly cheated against you. The factory bell at Lowell, Massachusetts rang out over the whole town. Lowell is a fascinating case because it was in many ways the most idealistic version of the factory dream. Francis Cabot Lowell, an American businessman who had studied the British mills and decided he could do it better, built an entire industrial city along the Mersey River in the 1820s. Designed from scratch around textile production. He hired young women from New England farming families, gave them dormitories, provided lectures and libraries and church attendance. The Lowell Mill Girls, as they came to be known, were held up by newspapers as a model of dignified industrial labour, and in the beginning many of them agreed. For young women in the 1820s, factory work meant wages, real wages, sometimes triple what a domestic servant earned, and a kind of independence that rural farm life had never offered. But there is always a but. The bell system at Lowell controlled every single moment of the day. There were bells for when the gates opened, bells for breakfast, bells for lunch, bells for when work commenced, bells for when it ended. A girl who missed the opening bell could find herself locked out, her wages docked, and her name recorded in a book that followed her to the next mill she applied to. By the 1840s, as the mill owners cut wages and lengthened hours to compete with cheaper British imports, those same women who had written enthusiastic letters home about their independence began organising the first major labour strikes in American history. One of them, a young woman named Sarah Bagley, stood before a crowd in 1845 and said essentially, "We came here as human beings, and they are trying to turn us into machines." She was 29 years old. She had been working in the mill since she was a teenager. Her words are worth sitting with, I think. Here is what a typical factory workday looked like, stripped down to its bare facts. The whistle or bell at 4:30 or 5 in the morning. Work began immediately. A breakfast break of perhaps 30 minutes sometime around 8 or 9. Back to the machines. A lunch break of 30 to 45 minutes around noon. Back to the machines. Work continued until 7 or 8 in the evening, sometimes later in winter when the mills ran by gaslight to extend productive hours into the darkness. That is 12 to 14 hours of standing at a machine performing the same motion, feeding thread, watching a loom, piecing broken yarn back together over and over and over again. The noise constant, the air bad, the floors vibrating. And here is something that the historical records make very clear: most accidents in the factories happened in the last 2 hours of the shift, not because the machines got more dangerous, but because the workers were exhausted. The Manchester Infirmary recorded in the year 1833 that nearly 40% of all accident cases treated in its wards were factory and mill related. Fingers crushed, hands caught in machinery, limbs gone in seconds, a child sent to crawl under a running loom to retrieve scraps of fabric because a child's small body could fit where an adult could not coming back out the same way they went in. I realise this is heavy, and I want to hold space for the weight of it because these were real people, but I also want to say something that I genuinely believe there is a reason history keeps asking us to remember them. Now there is a detail about this era that I find equal parts absurd and deeply human, and I cannot resist sharing it. Because the factories needed workers to arrive at exactly the right time, and because most workers could not afford watches or alarm clocks, a new profession was born, the knocker-upper. This was a real job, a person often, a woman often elderly who made her living by walking through working-class neighbourhoods before dawn, with a long stick or a blowpipe loaded with dried peas, tapping on bedroom windows and knocking on doors to wake the workers inside. Mary Smith, a knocker-upper in East London, was known for her pea shooter. She would stand in the street below and ping dried peas against second-floor windows until the person inside stirred. Charles Dickens mentions being knocked up in one of his novels as casually as we would mention setting an alarm today. This is so beautifully strange to me. The Industrial Revolution had created such a rigid demand for punctuality that an entire cottage industry had to develop just to get people to the factory on time. And somewhere in there is a quiet joke about progress. You gave people clock time, you took away their natural sense of when to wake up, and then you had to hire someone to come tap on their window with a stick every morning. Congratulations, modernity. But let me offer you something more than just bleakness, because the full story is more complicated and honestly more interesting than pure misery. Not everyone who entered the factory world hated it entirely. For some, particularly women and young people from the poorest rural communities, the factory, despite everything, represented something their parents had never had a regular wage. Cash. Actual money in your hand at the end of the week. Before factories, the rural poor often lived in a barter economy, or worked on the putting out system, taking raw materials home, spinning or weaving them, and returning finished goods in exchange for payment that could disappear if the merchant decided the quality was not quite right. There was no standard, no accountability, and in a bad harvest year there was nothing at all. The factory, for all its horrors, was predictable in a way that agricultural poverty was not. This is not a defense of the factory system. Let me be absolutely clear about that. The conditions were often genuinely brutal, the power imbalance was staggering, and what was done to children in these mills is one of the darker chapters of the 19th century. But history rarely gives us clean villains and clean heroes. It gives us complicated people making terrible choices inside terrible systems, and other people slowly, painfully organizing to change those systems. And that is a story worth knowing. In 1838, in the single parish of Manchester alone, there were 182 working cotton mills employing 39,000 people. One city, 1 year, 39,000 people inside those brick walls. Manchester had gone from a quiet market town of maybe 25,000 people in 1772 to a roaring industrial city of 300,000 by 1850. The growth was so fast, so unplanned, that the housing, the sanitation, the streets, none of it could keep up. Friedrich Engels, who spent time in Manchester in 1844, described entire neighbourhoods of workers crammed 15 to a damp cellar streets, running with sewage children playing in the same water people drank from. The machines got better every decade. The lives of the people feeding those machines did not keep pace, not yet. But something was stirring. Something that would eventually force an answer to a question that the factory bell had never bothered to ask: how much of a human being's waking life does an employer actually own? The answer, it turned out, was not everything. But arriving at that answer, naming it, fighting for it, writing it into law, was going to take the rest of the century. And it would begin, of all places, not with a politician or a philosopher. It would begin with the workers themselves, the weavers and the spinners and the mill girls, the ones who had lost their St. Mondays and their winter rests and their open windows, the ones who had given up the rhythm of seasons and taken up the rhythm of machines, and who were quietly, collectively beginning to wonder if there might be another way to live. What happened when they started asking that question out loud, and what it cost them, is where we are headed next. Something happened in the spring of 1842 that genuinely shook England to its core. A report landed on the desks of members of Parliament in London, over 1,800 pages long, stuffed with testimonies, hand-drawn illustrations, and the carefully recorded words of inspectors who had gone down into the coal mines of Yorkshire, Scotland and Wales, with one purpose: to find out what was actually happening down there. What they found stunned a nation that had told itself for decades that it had nothing to be ashamed of. The report was about children as young as 5 years old, working underground, in the dark. And once the British public read it, things would never quite be the same. Let me take you into those pages for a moment, because I think the details matter more than the statistics. A boy named Thomas, 8 years old, working as what was called a trapper in a Yorkshire coal mine. His job was to sit alone in a small hole carved into the tunnel wall, holding a string attached to a heavy wooden ventilation door. When he heard a coal cart approaching in the darkness, he pulled the string to open the door. When it passed, he let the door swing shut. That was the entire job, for 10 hours a day, in total darkness because candles were expensive, and his employer saw no reason to provide one for a child who only needed to pull a string. One young girl named Sarah Gooder, who was 8 years old when she gave her testimony, described her experience simply: She sat alone in the dark all day and she was frightened. She'd not known there would be so much darkness. Nobody had told her about the darkness. I do not know what to do with a sentence like that, honestly. I just know it deserves to be remembered. The trapper boys and girls were in a grim way among the luckier ones underground. Above them in the hierarchy of mine labour, if you can call it that, were the hurriers. Hurriers were older children, often between 7 and 12 years old, whose job was to push or pull the heavy wooden corves, those large baskets packed with coal, along the low tunnels of the mine. Because the tunnels were often only 16 inches high, in places they could not walk upright. They moved on all fours or bent double with a chain passed around their waist and between their legs attached to the cart behind them. A girl named Patience Kershaw, who was interviewed by one of the parliamentary inspectors, had a bald patch on her head from years of pressing her scalp against the underside of the coal cart as she pushed it. She told the inspector she walked, or rather crawled, around 11 miles underground each day. 11 miles, on her hands and knees, pushing coal. She was 17 at the time of her interview and had been doing this since she was 7. The inspector who recorded her testimony described her as looking filthy, ragged and deplorable. He meant it as a factual description, not a moral judgment, which tells you something about how normalised this sight had become to the people who lived near these mines. And another witness, Robert North, who'd worked in a Yorkshire coal mine since age 7, told the inspector plainly, "When I drew by the girdle and chain, my skin was broken and the blood ran down. If we said anything, they would beat us." Now I want to step back here for a moment and address something that I think about whenever I tell stories from this period. It is tempting, very tempting, to look at these facts from our modern vantage point and feel a kind of comfortable outrage. To think, how could anyone do this to children? How could society allow it? But the honest answer is more uncomfortable than that. Most of the parents who sent their children into the mines were not monsters. They were poor people making desperate calculations. A mining family in Yorkshire in 1830 might be living on wages that could not feed everyone if only the father worked. The child's contribution, paid at roughly 10 to 20% of an adult man's wage, which was itself barely enough to survive on, was the difference between eating and not eating. Desperation is not an excuse, but it is an explanation. And history, I think, asks us to hold both things at once. The system that placed those children underground was not simply the cruelty of individual parents or individual mine owners. It was the logic of an entire economic structure that had assigned a specific price to child labour and found it acceptable, even useful. What changed things was not a sudden surge of kindness from above. What changed things was publicity. The moment the 1842 report was released to the public newspapers across England ran excerpts from it. The London press published the illustrated engravings that accompanied the report, images of women and young girls pulling coal carts on all fours chained at the waist. Images so raw that many Victorian readers who had prided themselves on civilization and Christian values could not reconcile what they were seeing with the country they believed they lived in. Lord Ashley, the Member of Parliament who had commissioned the inquiry, introduced a bill in the House of Commons within weeks of publication. He made a very deliberate choice in how he framed his argument to Parliament. He knew that appealing purely to compassion might not be enough. Some of his colleagues had been hearing about factory and mine conditions for years and had managed to feel very little. So he focused strategically on something that Victorian gentlemen cared about deeply, the moral character of the home. He spoke about girls and young women working in conditions that were, in his words, incompatible with becoming good wives and mothers. It was, to put it gently, a somewhat limited moral framework. But it worked. The Mines Act passed in 1842, banning women and girls of any age from working underground, and setting a minimum age of 10 for boys in underground work. 10 years old. That was the victory. Think about that for a second. The passage of a law saying that a child of 10 was old enough to go into a coal mine was considered a humanitarian triumph. That was the bar in 1842, but the coal mines were only part of the story. Above ground, scattered throughout the cities of England and America, was another category of child labour so embedded in daily life that most respectable households interacted with it every single morning and thought nothing of it. The climbing boys. If you have ever seen the film version of Mary Poppins, and if you haven't, no judgment, there is a cheerful chimney sweep who dances on rooftops and sings catchy songs. It is a charming image. It has essentially nothing to do with reality. The real climbing boys of 19th century London were typically orphans or children from the poorest families apprenticed to a master sweep, sometimes as young as 3 or 4 years old. 3, not a typo. Their job was to climb inside the narrow flues of London chimneys, flues that could be as small as 7 inches square, though more commonly around 14 inches, scraping the accumulated soot from the brick walls as they went. They worked in the dark often while the chimney was still warm from the morning fire. The soot fell down onto their upturned faces. To keep the climbing boys small enough to fit inside the chimneys, some master sweeps deliberately underfed them. Let me say that again, because I want it to land. Some masters deliberately kept their child workers hungry, so their bodies would stay thin enough to do the job. There are records of masters who, when a boy seemed reluctant to climb, or was slowing down, would light a small fire beneath his feet to encourage faster movement upward. Boys got stuck in flues. When they did, the options were limited: pull them out by the legs with a rope, which sometimes worked, though not without injury, or break through the brickwork from outside. And sometimes neither option came in time. The coroner's verdict for a child found suffocated in a flue was typically recorded as accidental death. Sir Percival Pott, a London surgeon, published a paper in 1775 identifying what he called chimney sweeps cancer, the first occupational cancer ever documented in medical history. Constant exposure to coal soot caused tumours in the boys as they reached their teens. It was a slow, horrible disease, and it was entirely predictable, and it continued for nearly another century after it was first described. Now here is the detail about all of this that I find most quietly devastating. Laws were passed, multiple times. A Chimney Sweepers Act in 1788, another in 1834, another in 1840, and another in 1864, each one banning or restricting the use of children in chimney sweeping. Each one for years largely ignored. The Carlisle Patriot reported in the 1860s, after 30 years of legislation, that climbing boys were still being regularly employed to sweep the chimneys of churches, government offices and municipal buildings, the very institutions that were theoretically enforcing the law. There is a lesson in there about the distance between what a society says it values and what it actually tolerates. The practice did not meaningfully end until 1875, when a new act required chimney sweeps to be registered with the police and their work to be officially supervised. Enforcement at last, with teeth. It had taken nearly 100 years from the first documented outcry to the actual ending of the practice. 100 years. And yet, and this matters, I think it did end. That is not a small thing. The arc from that 1788 Act, which was ignored, to the 1875 Act, which was enforced, traces something real about how societies change. Not cleanly, not quickly, not without backsliding and compromise and infuriating delays, but in a direction. Someone had to keep pulling, and they did. The same Lord Ashley who pushed the 1842 Mines Act spent literally decades of his life campaigning for children. Richard Ostler, a factory reformer, published an open letter in 1830 calling the treatment of Yorkshire factory children a form of Yorkshire slavery. He compared the children of English mills unfavourably to enslaved people in British colonies, a deliberately inflammatory comparison that outraged mill owners and probably helped move the needle precisely because of how uncomfortable it made people. These were not perfect men with perfect arguments, but they kept asking a question that the industrial world preferred not to answer: what is a child's life worth? Which brings us to a different kind of worker entirely. We have talked about the children in the mines and the boys in the chimneys, but there is a third figure in the landscape of 19th century labour that often goes unexamined, someone who did not work in a factory at all, and yet whose working day was arguably just as long, just as hard, and far less likely to appear in any parliamentary report. She was a woman, and her workplace was the house. Coming up next, we're going into the world of the women who kept the 1800s running from the inside. The ones who woke before anyone else, who worked after everyone has gone to sleep, and who were told with complete seriousness that what they did all day was not really work at all. Pull your blanket a little closer, because what we are about to talk about is something that managed to stay almost completely invisible for most of the 19th century, even as it was happening in front of everyone's eyes every single day. You might have heard the phrase, "a woman's place is in the home." In the 1800s, that was not just a cultural opinion, it was a fully developed social ideology, with the name the doctrine of separate spheres. Men belonged in the public world, the factories, the offices, the political chambers. Women belonged in the private world, the home, the hearth, the family. It sounded tidy, almost poetic. But here is the part that gets left out of that portrait. Staying in the home was not rest. It was not leisure. It was not a simpler, gentler existence tucked away from the brutality of industrial life. For the vast majority of women in 19th century England and America, the home was not a refuge from hard work. It was the hardest work of all, and nobody was counting it. Let me describe a morning in the life of an ordinary working-class housewife in industrial Manchester around 1845. She wakes before her husband, before the children, often around 5 in the morning, sometimes earlier, because the fire has gone out overnight and the house is cold and nothing in the day can begin until the fire is lit again. The coal stove is her first opponent of the day. This is not a modern oven you turn a dial on and walk away from. This is a hulking iron machine that requires her full attention and genuine physical effort. First, she rakes out the ashes from the night before, sifting through the grate with her bare hands, in the grey morning dumping the ash pan, carrying the heavy pan outside. Then she relays the kindling, coaxes a flame, feeds in the coal piece by piece, adjusts the dampers with practiced precision to build the right temperature for both cooking and heating. Historical accounts suggest that a typical housewife in this period spent 4 or more hours every single day on the stove alone, stoking it, adjusting it, cleaning it, rubbing it down with thick black wax to prevent rust. 4 hours on one appliance before she'd cooked a single meal, and she did this 7 days a week, every week of every year, without a day off. Now the water. There is no running water in this house. There is no tap she can walk to in the kitchen and fill a pot. Every drop of water needed for cooking, for washing dishes, for laundry, for bathing, every drop of it had to be carried. Usually this meant a walk to the nearest pump or communal standpipe, often shared by dozens of families in the neighbourhood, often down the street or around the corner. Then carrying the heavy bucket home. Then carrying it upstairs if water was needed in the bedroom. Then heating it if warm water was required. Multiply that across a day's worth of needs: cooking, water, cleaning, water, laundry water, and you start to understand why historians who look carefully at working-class women's days in this period describe them as some of the most physically demanding lives of any person in the industrializing world. And then comes the laundry. Oh, the laundry. I have read more about Victorian laundry than any reasonable person should, and I want you to understand something. It was not a chore. It was a physical ordeal. Clothes were soaked for hours in hot water. Water that had been heated on the stove, remember, which required extra coal, extra fire, extra effort. Then they were scrubbed by hand with lye soap, wrung out by hand, rinsed, wrung out again, and if the weather allowed, hung outside. If not, they draped around the kitchen, which meant the fire had to be kept higher and the air stayed thick with steam. One historian's study of women who did laundry professionally for wealthier families in London found that a day's work in washing could last 20 hours. 20 hours of physically hauling water, scrubbing, wringing, carrying wet clothes. 20 hours for wages that were less than 2p an hour. Here is the part I genuinely find difficult to reconcile, and I want to say that plainly because I think it matters. All of this, the fires, the water, the laundry, the cooking from raw ingredients, because there were no processed foods. The childcare, the mending of clothes, the keeping of small animals in the backyard for extra food, the finishing of factory piecework done at home in the evenings to earn a few extra pennies. All of it was categorized officially and culturally as not work. It did not appear in census records. Even by 1891, only around 6% of married women in England were recorded as having any occupation at all. Not because they were idle, but because what they did every day had been defined ideologically and legally as something other than labour. This erasure was not accidental. The doctrine of separate spheres required women's domestic work to be invisible, because if you admitted it was work, real work, hard work, skilled work, then the whole philosophical structure fell apart. If washing clothes for 12 hours and cooking 3 meals from scratch and raising 5 children was labour deserving of recognition, then the natural division between public and private life was revealed for what it actually was, a system of organised unpaid labour, dressed up as something noble. Nobody wanted to look at it that directly, so mostly they did not. But let me add a layer here because the story gets more complicated and honestly more interesting when you look at working class women who were doing paid work outside the home as well. Because they existed in large numbers, they just were not supposed to. By the 1851 census, which was itself known to drastically undercount female employment, over 1 million women and girls in England and Wales were listed as domestic servants. That was the single largest category of female employment in the country, and it stayed that way through the end of the century. Think about that for a moment. The largest employer of women in Victorian England was other people's homes. A domestic servant, a housemaid, a cook's assistant, a scullery maid typically woke at 5 in the morning and finished her duties around 10 at night. 17 hours, 6 days a week with Sunday afternoon sometimes permitted off if the household was generous. She lived in the house she worked in, which meant she was never truly off duty. She could be called at any hour for any reason. She had no door she could close on the world. The upper housemaid in a well-run Victorian household began her day by opening shutters in every room of the house, cleaning all the fireplaces, shining the grates, carrying coal up from the cellar, and relaying every fire in the house, all before the family came downstairs for breakfast. And she did this without anyone noticing, which was in fact the professional standard. A good servant was invisible. Her labour was so smoothly performed that the family could pretend if they chose to that the house simply took care of itself. This invisibility, I think, tells you everything. Now I want to introduce you to a category of woman who has always fascinated me, someone who occupied a very particular, very painful position in the economy of the 19th century, and who has been almost entirely forgotten. She is the woman who did both. Not the domestic servant whose entire life was absorbed by one employer's household. Not the comfortable middle-class wife whose labour was unpaid, but at least recognised as her natural role. I mean the factory worker who's also a wife and mother. The woman who came off a 12-hour shift at the mill and then went home to the stove, the water, the laundry and the children. One woman factory worker quoted in a report from the 1840s said, with a kind of exhausted precision that I find haunting, "Let's swallow our dinner, and when we have time, chew it." She was describing in 6 words the arithmetic of a life with no margin. Work all day, come home, feed children, fall into a chair, get up and do it again. The male reformers of the time, men who genuinely cared about the condition of working people and were fighting hard for better conditions, often argued that the solution was to keep married women out of the factories entirely, pay men enough that their families could survive on one wage, and let women return to their proper sphere. It was well-meaning. It was also, to be direct about it, a solution that kept the fundamental structure of women's unpaid domestic labour intact, while removing their access to the only income they could call their own. A working woman in the 1840s had essentially no legal right to the wages she earned. Under the law as it stood in England until 1870, any money a married woman earned belonged legally to her husband. She could work a full shift in a cotton mill, walk home with her pay envelope, and have no legal claim to what was inside it. Her labour was never quite her own. In the factory it belonged to the employer, at home it belonged to the household, and the wages she earned technically belonged to her husband. Let me tell you about one woman who pushed back against all of this quietly, in a way that the historical record almost missed entirely. Her name was Clementina Black. She was one of only 2 women delegates at the Women's Trades Union Council in 1888, and she stood up and proposed the first resolution for equal pay in British trade union history. What is remarkable about her argument is how careful she had to be. She did not argue for equal pay on the grounds of women's equal humanity, though she clearly believed that. She argued for it on purely economic grounds, that women's lower wages were dragging down men's wages too, because employers could replace one man with 2 women, and still pay less overall. The resolution was framed strategically as being in men's interests. It passed. It would take another 80 years and a formal Act of Parliament before equal pay was enshrined in British law. But in 1888, in a room full of men who were largely sceptical of women's presence in the labour movement at all, a woman stood up with a carefully constructed argument and moved the needle 1 notch. I find that image oddly moving, not triumphant exactly, but steady, persistent, clear-eyed about the constraints she was working inside. Before I leave this particular world of women and work, I want to say something that I think matters beyond the history lesson. We have a habit, I think, of looking back at the 19th century and seeing women's domestic labour as simply the background, the quiet, unexamined setting against which the real history of industry and politics and invention happened. But when you look at the actual hours, when you add up the fires, the water, the laundry, the cooking, the childcare, the piecework, done at home after dark, what you see is not background. What you see is the engine. Without that unpaid, unrecorded, systematically invisible labour, the factories would not have had workers to show up every morning. The children who kept those factories running would not have survived infancy. The city of the industrial world would not have functioned for a single day. The woman with her coal stove at 5 a.m. was just as much a part of the industrial economy as the man walking through the mill gates at the same hour. She just was not in the ledger. And speaking of ledgers of who counted and who did not, and what the men in the comfortable offices of Victorian England actually did with their days, while all of this was unfolding around them, that is where we are headed next. Because there was a whole other class of workers rising in this century. Men who never touched a machine. Men who wore clean clothes to work. Men who carried something new and slightly terrifying into the world, a briefcase and a fountain pen, and a title that had not existed 50 years before. They were the gentlemen of the office, and their world was stranger and more fragile than it looked. Cast your mind for a moment to a particular kind of building that multiplied across the cities of England and America throughout the middle of the 19th century. It was not a factory, though it grew because of factories. It was not a mine, though it processed the wealth that mines produced. From the outside, it looked respectable. Tall windows, solid brick, a brass nameplate by the door. Inside, rows of men sat on high stools, bent over slanted wooden desks, copying numbers and letters into enormous ledgers by the light of tallow candles or, in better establishments, gas lamps. This was the counting house, the precursor of the modern office, and the men inside it were a new kind of creature in the history of human labour, the clerk. They were not quite workers. They were not quite gentlemen. And that uneasy position, stuck precisely between two worlds, would come to define one of the strangest, most quietly anxious lives of the entire Victorian century. Let me give you a number first, because it is genuinely astonishing. In 1851, there were approximately 140,000 office workers in Britain, representing less than 1% of the entire labour force, barely visible in the statistics. By 1914, that figure had grown to roughly 1 million, from less than 1% to over 4% of the national workforce in 60 years. That is not gradual growth. That is an explosion. And what drove it was the sheer administrative complexity of industrial capitalism itself. Factories needed paperwork, railways needed schedules, contracts, ticketing systems. Banks needed accounts maintained across dozens of branches. Insurance companies needed risk calculations. Government departments ballooned as the state grew. Every transaction of the industrializing world needed to be recorded, filed, and managed by human hands holding pens. The clerk was born of necessity. But what he became's what he meant, socially, emotionally, existentially. That is a far more interesting story. Here is the single most defining fact about the Victorian clerk, the fact that shaped his entire psychology. He wore a white collar. That sounds trivial. But in the rigid social world of 19th century England, the white collar was not a fashion choice. It was a declaration. It meant you worked with your mind, not your hands. It meant you did not get dirty. It meant, at least in theory, that you were a gentleman or close enough to one that the distinction barely mattered, except that it did matter, enormously. And this is where things get genuinely fascinating. A junior clerk in the 1850s might earn somewhere between £20 and £80 a year. A skilled factory worker, a man who worked with his hands, who was socially below the clerk in every Victorian ranking, might earn the same or sometimes more. Think about that. The man at the ledger and the man at the loom could be bringing home almost identical wages, but they lived in completely different social worlds. The factory worker knew what he was, a labouring man. He did not pretend otherwise. The clerk, however, was caught in a much more exhausting performance. He had to maintain the appearance of respectability on an income that barely supported it. This meant a particular suit that had to be kept pressed and clean. It meant living in a neighbourhood slightly better than he could actually afford. It meant not joining the labour unions that were organising the factory workers downstairs, because to join a union was to admit that you were fundamentally a worker. And the entire psychological architecture of the clerk's identity was built on not being a worker. Historians have described this with a certain gentle amusement as the clerk's gentlemanly delusion, and it was in many ways the most expensive delusion of the century. Can you picture the actual daily life inside one of these offices? Let me take you there. A typical clerking day in the 1840s or 1850s began not at 9 in the morning, which is the schedule we might imagine. It began considerably earlier. Historical records from this period suggest that a standard working week for clerks was 6 days, and daily hours commonly ran from 10 to 14 hours. Some counting houses opened before 7 in the morning and did not release their clerks until 8 or 9 at night. The physical environment was, not to put too fine a point on it, terrible. Desks were crammed into unheated rooms. Lighting was poor. The high windows that looked so impressive from the street were actually designed to let in natural light, but they never quite managed it on a grey November morning in London. The ink on the pen froze in cold snaps. The candles guttered. The high stools after 12 hours produced a particular kind of back pain that Victorian physicians apparently wrote about with some frequency, and the work itself, the actual substance of what a clerk did all day, was monotonous in a way that defies easy description. Copying, columns of figures, copying again, checking, copying once more. The same numbers, the same letters, day after week after year, moving through ledgers that grew fatter as the empires they recorded grew larger. One instructional manual for young clerks, published in 1848, advised its readers on the correct posture for prolonged copying, the best way to avoid ink stains on the cuffs of shirts one could not easily afford to replace, and the appropriate level of deference to show a senior partner when he entered the room. Deference to a man who might barely be paying you enough to eat on. But here is the thing that I keep coming back to, the detail that makes the Clark story feel oddly modern, and therefore oddly moving the anxiety. Victorian clerks were, by all historical accounts, extraordinarily anxious people. Not about the work exactly. The work was tedious but comprehensible. They were anxious about their position, their status, whether they would be promoted, whether they would be let go, whether the man next to them was better connected, whether their handwriting was neat enough to recommend them to a better firm. The historian David Lockwood, writing about Victorian clerical workers, described the relationship between a clerk and his employer as a kind of unspoken social contract, a gentleman's agreement built entirely on trust and personal loyalty. The clerk would work hard, behave impeccably, never unionize, never cause trouble. In return, the employer would reward him with security, eventual promotion, perhaps a pension, except that this promise was in many cases never fulfilled. It was an expectation, not a contract. And when the larger companies of the later Victorian era began hiring clerks in bulk, treating them more like interchangeable parts than like aspiring gentlemen, the betrayal of that expectation left a particular kind of psychological wound that shows up interestingly in the literature of the time. Charles Dickens, who had himself worked as a clerk in his youth and never forgot it, gave the world Bob Cratchit, the underpaid copying clerk in A Christmas Carol. Pale, patient, perpetually cold, wearing his white collar like a flag of dignity that nobody else seemed to notice. You can feel Dickens's own buried resentment in every line. Now let me take you completely out of the city, because one of the stories I find most under-examined in the whole landscape of 19th century work is the story of the people who stayed behind on the farms. The ones who did not make the journey to Manchester or London or Lowell, Massachusetts. By the 1851 census, roughly 25% of all able-bodied men and boys in England were still employed in agriculture. 1.5 million people working the land. That number would drop to 17% by the 1880s and to 12% by the turn of the century, a collapse driven by machinery, by cheap imported grain from North America after the end of the American Civil War, and by the relentless pull of industrial wages. But in the middle of the century, those fields were still full of people, and their working life was completely different from anything we have talked about so far. The Victorian agricultural year had its own rhythm, slower than the factory, more intimate with the actual physical world, but in its own way just as demanding and often far more precarious. Spring meant ploughing and sowing. Long days in cold mud, bent behind a horse-drawn plough turning the heavy English earth. The quality of the ploughing mattered too shallow, and the seeds would not bed properly. Too deep, and the soil would take too long to warm. A skilled ploughman was genuinely skilled in a way that took years to learn, and that the clumsy mechanization of the later century would try and often fail to replicate. Summer brought the haymaking, then the fruit harvest, then the great cereal harvest in August and September, the organising event of the entire rural year. Before the mowing machines began to appear in the mid-1800s, grain was harvested by hand with scythes in teams that moved through the fields from before sunrise to after sunset. Men, women and children working together in a rhythm that had not changed in centuries. The Thomas Hardy novel, Far from the Madding Crowd, describes the hiring fairs at Michaelmas, the 29th of September, where farm labourers lined up in market squares wearing symbols of their trade, a piece of whipcord twisted in the hat for a carter, a fragment of straw for a thatcher, a shepherd holding his crook. Farmers walked along the line, inspecting, questioning, deciding. It reads honestly like something from a much older world. And that is precisely the point. Then winter came, and for the farm labourer winter was something different from what it was for the factory worker. In the factory, winter meant longer hours by gaslight because the machines did not care about the season. For the farm labourer, winter was when the visible work thinned out the threshing of stored grain by hand in big barns, the mending of fences, the clearing of ditches, the tending of livestock. Some of this work paid, some did not, and in the darkest months there was less work, which meant less money, which in a cash wage economy meant less food. The economic precariousness of agricultural life in the 19th century is something that gets softened over in the popular imagination of it. We think of the countryside and feel a kind of nostalgia for open air and honest toil and the turning of seasons, and there was some of that. But there was also this: by the end of a bad winter, a farm labourer's family might be surviving on bread and potatoes and little else. The children went to the fields to glean, to follow behind the reapers, and pick up any grain left on the ground, a practice as old as the Book of Ruth in the Bible, and still common in Victorian English fields. What the gleaned grain became was flour for bread. Survival bread baked and eaten quietly, while people in London argued about trade policy. And yet, and this matters too, rural agricultural workers who survived to adulthood were, according to the military recruitment figures of the period, measurably healthier and more physically robust than their urban counterparts. When the British Army went to recruit in the industrial cities in the later decades of the century, they found young men who were undernourished, shorter than average, and frequently diseased. When they went to the countryside, they found men who could work. The dirty air, the contaminated water, the overcrowded tenements, the coal dust and cotton lint, all of it was slowly eating the urban working class from the inside. The farm labourer was often poor, but at least the air moved. So we now have this complicated panorama spread out across the century. The factory worker disciplined by the clock and the bell, trading bodily freedom for a regular wage. The clerk disciplined by anxiety and status, trading honest poverty for the fiction of respectability. The farm labourer disciplined by weather and season, and the unpredictability of harvest, trading security for the open sky. Each of them working hard, each of them worn down in different ways, each of them at the mercy of forces much larger than themselves, and yet floating above all three of these worlds there was another category entirely. Men who did not work long hours in cold offices or muddy fields. Men whose leisure was so elaborate it had its own literature, its own rituals, its own geography. Men who, if they worked at all in any visible sense, did so with an almost studied casualness, as if effort itself were slightly vulgar. The English gentleman, and his relationship with rest, with a concept of not working, of time genuinely owned and freely spent, is a story that reveals more about the 19th century's deepest assumptions than almost anything else. Where did all that leisure actually go? What did people with genuine free time do with it in a century that are simultaneously glorifying work as a moral virtue and desperately trying to escape it? That is exactly where we are headed next. So there it is, the counting house clerk with his white collar and his ink-stained fingers performing respectability on a salary that barely paid for it. The farm labourer in his leased cottage clinging to land that was slowly being fenced off around him. The skilled craftsman watching his trade be divided into pieces and handed to strangers. 3 very different lives, 3 very different kinds of exhaustion. But here is the question that I keep coming back to, the one that I think history actually wants us to ask. When the world they had always known began to close in, when the common land disappeared, when the wages fell, when the threshing machine arrived to take the winter work, what did these people do? Some left, some went to the cities, some simply endured, and some of them fought back. Not with armies, not with weapons, with something much stranger and in many ways much braver, a meeting under a tree. Let me take you to the village of Tolpuddle, in the county of Dorset, England. The year's 1833. Tolpuddle is a small place, a cluster of cottages along a road, a church, a green, a sycamore tree that has been standing in the village for so long that nobody can quite remember when it was not there. This is not a place of drama or history. It is a place of mud and cold mornings and the smell of rain on earth and the dull grinding arithmetic of poverty. The farm workers of Tolpuddle are being paid 9 shillings a week. That is already barely enough to survive on a family's weekly costs for rent, and bread and potatoes runs to around 13 shillings, meaning that every week, no matter how carefully a man manages his money, he is falling behind. And then the local farmers announce a cut. 9 shillings becomes 8, then 8 becomes 7, and there are whispers, credible ones apparently, of a further cut to 6 shillings a week. The men of Tolpuddle go to the local magistrates and ask formally and politely whether there is any law that might protect them. The magistrates tell them that employers have the right to pay whatever they choose, and workers have no choice but to accept it. No law, no protection, no recourse. So one evening a group of men meet. They meet under the old sycamore tree on the village green, which is, I think, as perfect a detail as history ever produces, the oldest, most rooted living thing in the village, as the backdrop for 6 men trying to figure out how to hold on. Their leader is a man named George Lovelace. He is 37 years old. He's a Methodist lay preacher, which matters because it means he is used to speaking in front of people, used to organising, used to the idea that ordinary men might have moral authority, regardless of their social position. George and his brother James, along with 4 other men, Thomas Stanfield and his son John James Brine and James Hammett, form what they call the Friendly Society of Agricultural Labourers. Their demand is simple, no less than 10 shillings a week. They begin meeting regularly. 40 men from the village join at the first gathering alone. They take an oath of solidarity. They promise to support one another. That oath will destroy them. Before I continue with what happened to George Lovelace and his companions, I need to give you the wider context because their story does not make full sense without it. The years round 1830 were not quiet years in the English countryside. The enclosure of common land, the long grinding process by which village commons and shared fields were fenced off into private estates, removing the safety net that rural families had relied on for generations, had been proceeding for decades. Before enclosure, a poor farm labourer's family might have grazed a cow or a few geese on the common gathered wood for fuel-grown vegetables on a shared plot. Not much, but enough to buffer a bad wage week or a poor harvest. After enclosure, all of that was gone. What remained was wages, and wages alone at the levels being paid in southern England in the 1830s were not enough to live on. In the autumn of 1830, the tension finally cracked open. On the night of the 28th of August, 1830, an anonymous group of labourers in East Kent destroyed a threshing machine. The threshing machine had been arriving in farm after farm across England, a device that mechanically separated grain from straw, eliminating the hand-threshing work that had employed rural labourers through the winter months for generations. Without threshing work, winter meant no income. For a family already on the edge, no winter income meant starvation. The machine destruction in Kent was not an isolated act, it was a spark. Within weeks, the unrest had spread across the south of England like fire through dry grass. Barns were burned, hayricks lit up the night sky over Dorset and Wiltshire and Hampshire. Anonymous letters arrived at the gates of country houses signed with a name that nobody could trace Captain Swing. The letters were written in plain language: pay your workers more, destroy your machines, or face consequences. Nobody ever found Captain Swing because Captain Swing did not exist. The name was a collective invention, a way for desperate men to speak with a single voice while protecting individual identities. It is, when you think about it, a rather clever piece of social technology invented by people with no formal education and no political power. But the Swing riots, as they came to be called, were met with overwhelming force. 9 men were eventually hanged. Over 400 were sentenced to transportation to penal colonies in Australia. 500 received prison sentences. The machine breakers went to the gallows or the convict ships, and the machines stayed in the fields. George Lovelace had watched all of this. He had drawn his own conclusions. Violence, he believed, was not the answer, not because it was wrong in principle, but because it did not work. The state was larger and more powerful, and it would always win a direct confrontation. What might work, he thought, was organisation, solidarity, a collective refusal to accept wages below a survivable level. So he formed his society. He gathered his 40 men. And in February of 1834, at 4 o'clock in the morning, there was a knock on his cottage door. It was a constable with a warrant for his arrest. The 6 Tolpuddle men were taken to Dorchester, stripped of their clothes, searched, and held in the cells beneath the courthouse. George Lovelace described those cells later. The smoke and dampness were so severe, he wrote, that breathing was nearly impossible. They spent 3 days there before their trial. At the trial, they were charged not with forming a union, which was technically legal since 1824, but with administering an illegal oath. A naval anti-mutiny law from 1797, written to prevent sailors from swearing secret pacts of rebellion, was dug up and applied to 6 farm workers who had promised to support one another under a village sycamore tree. The judge told the court that the safety of the country was at stake. The jury, packed with local landowners and the magistrate who had initiated the arrest, convicted all 6 men within hours. The sentence was the maximum available 7 years transportation to Australia. In the moment of sentencing, George Lovelace was reported to have scribbled a few lines on a scrap of paper. They were words from a hymn he knew. God is our guide. No sword we draw, we kindle not war's battle fires. By reason, justice, love, we claim to live in peace, our own desires. He was taken in chains to a prison hulk moored in the Thames estuary, and then shipped to the penal colony in Van Diemen's Land, what we now call Tasmania. But here is where the story turns. Because England, it turned out, was paying attention. The news of the Tolpuddle verdict spread from the press gallery to every newspaper in the country within days. And the reaction from people who had never met a farm labourer who lived in London and Birmingham and Manchester and had nothing personal at stake was something close to fury. This was too much. 6 men transported for forming a society and taking an oath that hurt nobody, an oath sworn not to destroy machines, not to burn barns, but simply to stand together and ask for enough money to eat on. An 1834 protest march in London drew crowds that contemporary accounts describe as enormous tens of thousands of people marching through the streets to deliver a petition to Parliament. The petition itself eventually collected 800,000 signatures, 800,000 names in a country of roughly 14 million people, roughly 1 in 17 of the entire population. The government, deeply embarrassed, eventually yielded. In March of 1836, 2 years after the conviction, Home Secretary Lord John Russell secured full pardons for all 6 men. George Lovelace was notified of his pardon in a rather bureaucratic way. Given the circumstances, a letter was sent to the estate in Tasmania, where he was working as a convict labourer. He had to wait months more for passage home. He arrived back in England in 1837. He was welcomed as a hero. And then, like most heroes of the Victorian working class, he disappeared into an ordinary life, eventually emigrating with several of the other martyrs to Ontario, Canada, where they farmed land that they actually owned. James Hammett, the only one who stayed in England, died in Dorchester Workhouse in 1891. The same workhouse system that had been used as a threat against the rural poor throughout his entire life. What do I make of all this? I find myself sitting with the Tolpuddle story for longer than most history I encounter, and I think I know why. It is not a triumphant story exactly. The men were punished for years. Their families suffered in their absence. The wages in Dorset did not immediately improve after the pardons. The power of the landowners over rural life did not crumble, but something did happen. The visibility of what they did, the clarity of their cause, the disproportionate brutality of the response, the 800,000 signatures put into public consciousness. An idea that had previously been felt but not quite spoken, that a working person has the right to organise, to negotiate, to refuse collectively to be paid a wage that is designed to keep them too hungry to object. That idea, once spoken clearly enough for 800,000 people to put their names to it, did not go away. And here is the connection. I keep finding the thread that runs through all of this, through the factory worker and the farm labourer and the clerk and the woman at her coal stove, the thing that makes this century so remarkable to study. What every one of these people was really fighting over in their different ways was time. The factory worker was fighting for a shorter working day. The farm labourer was fighting to keep the winter rest that enclosure and mechanisation were taking from him. The clerk was fighting to maintain the fiction of leisure that justified the sacrifice of his wages. The woman was fighting simply to have some hours in the day that were not spoken for by someone else. All of it underneath was a negotiation about how human time should be divided. Who owns it? Who spends it? And what it costs to take it back. And time, it turns out, was where the 19th century was most radical of all, not just in how people worked, but in how and whether they slept. Because while all of this was happening in the fields and factories and courtrooms of England and America, something stranger and quieter was occurring in the bedrooms. Something that we have almost entirely forgotten, because the century that produced it also eventually erased it. The way people slept in the 1800s was completely fundamentally different from the way you sleep tonight. And the story of how that happened and what was lost is one of the most unexpectedly personal pieces of history I have ever come across. All right, I need you to do something for me before we go any further. Think about the last time you woke up in the middle of the night. Not because of a noise, not because of an alarm, just woke up somewhere between midnight and 3 in the morning, completely alert, lying there in the dark while the rest of the house was quiet. Did you panic a little? Did you reach for your phone to check the time? Did you lie there calculating how many hours of sleep you had left, feeling that low-grade anxiety that comes from being awake when you feel like you should be asleep? If so, and I say this with genuine affection, you have been gaslit by modernity, because what you experienced in that dark, quiet hour was not a malfunction. It was in all likelihood the most ancient and natural sleep pattern your body knows, a pattern that humans followed for thousands of years, a pattern that the 19th century, with its gas lamps and factory schedules and neurotic obsession with productivity, quietly erased from human culture so thoroughly that within 2 generations people had completely forgotten it ever existed. This is the story of how we all forgot how to sleep. Let me introduce you to a historian named Roger Kirch. He is professor at Virginia Tech, and he spent years studying the nocturnal life of pre-industrial Europe, the history of the night in all its social and cultural complexity. He was not initially studying sleep at all. He was reading through old legal depositions in a London archive dusty court documents from the 1690s when he came across a passing reference by a 9-year-old girl named Jane Roth. She mentioned almost as a detail too ordinary to explain that her mother had woken up after her first sleep and gone out. The phrase caught Kirch's eye. First sleep. As if there were a second. As if waking up in the middle of the night and then going back to sleep was so normal, so unremarkable, that a child would use the phrase without any explanation, the way you might say someone went out after lunch. He began to look for other references, and then more still. By the time he published his research, he had found over 2,000 references to first sleep and second sleep in historical documents across a dozen languages spanning from ancient Greece through the 19th century. Diaries, medical texts, novels, court records, prayer books, letters, legal depositions, references in English, French, Latin, Italian, references in documents from Africa, South Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, 2,000 references to a sleep pattern that the modern world had completely forgotten existed. So what exactly was this pattern? Let me describe it as clearly as I can because the details matter. Most pre-industrial households in Europe and across much of the world went to bed considerably earlier than we do today, without electric lighting, without gas lamps, without anything more than a candle, or the dying embers of a fire. There was simply nothing to do after dark that was worth staying awake for. Bedtime in ordinary households commonly fell between 9 and 10 in the evening. They slept for approximately 3 to 3.5 hours. Then naturally, without alarm, without disturbance, they woke up, sometime around midnight or in the first hour or two after it. This waking was not violent, not anxious. Historical accounts describe it as a gentle surfacing, a quiet transition from deep sleep to calm awareness. And then for roughly an hour, sometimes a little less, sometimes a little more, they were awake. This period had a name. In some sources it was called simply the watch. And what people did during the watch was, according to the historical record, wonderfully varied and thoroughly human. Some people prayed. The medieval church had for centuries encouraged the practice of midnight prayer, and for ordinary households this midnight waking fit naturally into a devotional rhythm that felt both practical and spiritually meaningful. Some people talked, quietly in the dark with whoever was lying beside them. Historians have found references to couples having their most intimate conversations during this interval, the kind of conversation that the business of the day never quite allowed. Some people got up to tend the fire, check on children, look after sick animals. A farmer in this watch hour might go to the barn. A baker might begin preparing dough. A servant might use the quiet to accomplish some task before the household woke. And some people, here is the detail I find most unexpectedly charming, went to visit their neighbours. I know, it sounds bizarre to us. Imagine someone knocking on your door at 2 a.m. for a social call. But in a world without electric light, without the noise and stimulation of modern evenings, midnight was not the strange and solitary hour it has become. It was simply the middle of the night, a quiet, unhurried time that belonged in a small way to anyone who happened to be awake. Now here is the piece that fascinated me most when I first came across it, because it connects history to biology in a way that feels almost too neat to be true. In the 1990s, a sleep researcher at the National Institute of Mental Health named Thomas Ware conducted an experiment. He took a group of healthy men, and over the course of a month gradually extended the period of darkness they experienced each day, eventually giving them 14 hours of darkness and 10 hours of light, roughly approximating what a person in Northern Europe would have experienced in winter, before artificial lighting existed. At first, the participants simply slept for longer, apparently catching up on accumulated sleep debt that most of us carry around without realizing it. But after a few weeks, something interesting happened. Their sleep patterns began to shift. They started going to bed earlier. They slept for 3 to 4 hours. Then they woke up for an hour or two of quiet wakefulness. Then they slept again until morning, spontaneously, without being told to, without any cultural priming or historical knowledge. Their bodies deprived of artificial light simply reverted to the old pattern. And here is the detail that gave Ver and his colleagues pause. During that midnight waking interval, the participants' bodies showed elevated levels of prolactin, a hormone associated with feelings of calm peace and a kind of dreamy, relaxed awareness. The same hormone that nursing mothers produce. One researcher described the midnight waking state as an altered state of consciousness, not unlike meditation. Think about that for a moment. The bodies of modern humans, separated from artificial light for just a few weeks, spontaneously recreated a sleep pattern that appears in Homer's Odyssey, in Virgil's Aeneid, in medieval prayer books, in the legal depositions of 17th century Scotland, in the diaries of 18th century England. The pattern did not need to be taught. It was there already waiting. Now you might be wondering, when exactly did all this change? When did the world go from 2 sleeps to 1? The answer is gradually, unevenly, and driven almost entirely by one thing: light. It started not with the electric light bulb, as many people assume, but earlier with the rapid expansion of gaslight in the first decades of the 19th century. In 1807, gas streetlights were introduced in London. By 1823, the city had nearly 40,000 gas lamps illuminating over 200 miles of streets. A single gas lamp, by the estimates of contemporaries, was approximately 10 times as powerful as a candle. Suddenly, for the first time in human history, the night could be made genuinely bright. Theatres stayed open later. Shops kept their doors open after dark. Social life extended into the evening hours that had previously been given over to early bedtimes, and the effect on sleep was precisely what you would predict. People began going to bed later, but they still had to wake up at the same time they always had. Work did not accommodate the new social hours. The factory whistle did not care when you had finally closed your eyes. As Roger Ekirch describes it, the gaslight pushed back the time people went to bed, and yet they still had to get up at the normal time, so they slept less. The natural first sleep expanded, pushed later and later, and the midnight waking interval was squeezed into nothing. The second sleep, deprived of its anchor, shrank to what one historian called a few stolen minutes before the morning. By the mid-1800s, among urban populations in England and America, the consolidated single sleep, the unbroken 8-hour block we now consider natural and correct, was becoming the norm. Not because it was biologically superior, not because anyone had decided it was healthier, but because the night had been lit up, and the old darkness that had cradled the watch for thousands of years was gone. Here is the layer of this story that I find genuinely poignant, and I want to stay with it for a moment. By the time the single sleep had become the standard, the old pattern had been so thoroughly forgotten that people who woke naturally in the night, people who were in a very real sense simply following an ancient biological rhythm, began to experience that waking as a problem, a disorder, a failure. In 1900, a British physician named William Broadbent wrote that sleeplessness had become one of the torments of our age and generation. Victorian magazines ran anxious articles about insomnia. Readers wrote letters to the Spectator describing their self-devised stratagems for getting back to sleep. A physician in the 1830s published a treatise called something like The Art of Procuring Sound and Refreshing Slumber at Will, a phrase that reveals in its very urgency how recently people had stopped being able to do it naturally. A popular remedy in the later Victorian era was chloral hydrate, one of the first pharmaceutical sleep aids. Physicians prescribed it broadly. Patients became dependent on it, and the more dependent people became on artificial sleep, the more the old natural pattern was buried and forgotten. The middle-of-the-night waking that had once been accompanied by prolactin-induced calm and quiet conversation and prayer had become in the space of a few generations a symptom requiring medication. Do you ever wake up at 3 in the morning and feel not exactly anxious but strangely unexpectedly peaceful, as if something in you has surfaced from a great depth and is simply resting there quiet and present? That might be older than you think. Now, I want to be honest about the full picture here because good history requires it. Not every scholar agrees entirely with Kirch's framing. Some historians have pointed out that his 2,000 references, while impressive, are still a relatively small sample from centuries of human life, and that sleep experiences varied enormously across class season geography and individual biology. There is reasonable academic debate about how universal the two-sleep pattern truly was, and whether it was a deliberate practice or simply an experience that sometimes happened. What seems clear and well supported is this: the idea that waking in the middle of the night was normal, was unremarkable, and was often pleasant. That idea was genuinely widespread. It shows up in too many independent sources across too many centuries and cultures to be dismissed. The expectation of unbroken, consolidated sleep as a baseline, as the default human experience, is recent, very recent, and it came at a cost that we are still arguably paying. In a 2015 interview, Kirch told a journalist something that I have not been able to stop thinking about since I first read it. He said, middle-of-the-night insomnia was a rare problem before the late 1800s. As early as the 16th century, it was utterly normal, unworthy of comment. Unworthy of comment. The thing that sends millions of people to their doctors, that drives the global sleep aid industry, that fills the shelves of pharmacies, was for most of human history utterly normal, and we traded it away for gaslight. Here is something practical to sit with as you settle deeper into this night. If you wake up in an hour or two, and you feel that quiet, alert calm rather than panic, perhaps you're not broken. Perhaps your body is simply doing something very old. The people who used that hour to think, to pray, to have the conversations they had been too busy for during the day, they were onto something. Not in a romanticized everything was better before way. Life was hard and sleep was not always peaceful, and history does not give us easy nostalgia. But they understood intuitively that the night had its own character. That darkness was not just the absence of day, that the quiet hours were worth something. Maybe what we call insomnia is sometimes just the watch, the old interval waiting patiently inside us, unchanged across millennia, not quite sure why we're fighting it so hard. The 1800s, we've been discovering, were a century that transformed almost everything about how people worked, how they suffered, how they organized their days. But some things were being lost even as other things were being built. The two-sleep pattern was one. The natural breathing room of winter was another. St. Monday, the craftsman's quiet defiance, was slowly disappearing. And all of this loss of rest was happening while at the same time a new kind of room was being designed, a room built specifically around sleep, specifically around the body at rest, a room that would become by the end of the century a kind of sanctuary, the Victorian bedroom. What happened inside it? What rules governed it? What fears surrounded it? What strange and elaborate rituals people performed before surrendering to sleep? That is where we're going next. The story we ended with, the slow erasure of the watch, the midnight waking, the two-sleep pattern that had endured for thousands of years, did not happen in a vacuum. It happened inside a specific physical space, a room that the 1800s were in the process of reinventing almost from scratch. Because here is something that most people do not realize: the bedroom as we understand it today, private enclosed reserved solely for sleep belonging to one person, or at most a couple, is not an ancient human institution. It is a Victorian invention. And the story of how it came to be and what happened inside it is one of the strangest and most intimate corners of the entire 19th century. Let us go back even further for a moment, because context matters here. For most of human history, sleep was not a private act. It was communal. Before the 19th century, and in poorer households well into it, sharing a bed was completely normal. Not just with a spouse, with children, with siblings, with lodgers, occasionally with servants, and in the worst urban tenements of early industrial England with strangers. Historical accounts from cities like Manchester and London in the 1820s and 1830s describe lodging houses where 5, 8, 10 people shared a single room, sometimes a single mattress. Friedrich Engels, walking through the working-class neighbourhoods of Manchester in 1844, documented families of 5 or 6 people sleeping in one small dark room, often without proper beds at all, on straw or rags piled on the floor. And this was not considered monstrous by those who lived it. It was simply necessity. The shared warmth, the proximity of other bodies in the cold, these were not embarrassments. They were survival. Even in wealthier households of earlier centuries, bed sharing carried no shame. Servants sometimes slept at the foot of their mistress's bed for protection. Guests staying the night might be put in with a member of the household. Travellers at inns routinely shared with strangers. The historian Roger E. Kirch documented how women particularly valued the comfort of having a companion nearby during the long dark hours. One account from the 1780s describes how a woman refused to sleep alone while her husband was away, and had her maid sleep beside her, because, as the maid put it simply, her mistress never durst sleep alone. That phrase, never durst sleep alone. There was something honest in it, an acknowledgement that darkness was genuinely frightening, and that the presence of another human body was a form of protection, even if only psychological. Then the Victorians arrived, and the Victorians had opinions about everything, including where you should sleep, and who should be allowed to watch. The shift toward private enclosed sleeping spaces happened for several reasons at once. Urbanization was one. The new row houses and terraced cottages of industrial cities were built with separate specific rooms, each with a designated purpose in a way that older multi-use domestic spaces had not been. There was a room for eating, a room for sitting, and just one room for sleeping. Religion was another. The evangelical Christianity that swept through England and America in the early decades of the 19th century was deeply preoccupied with modesty, chastity, and the separation of the sexes. The idea of mixed-sex sleeping arrangements, even innocent ones, began to feel transgressive in a way it simply had not before. And then there was class anxiety. As the middle class grew and distinguished itself from both the aristocracy above and the working poor below, the private bedroom became one of its defining markers. Having a bedroom to yourself, or a bedroom that you shared only with your spouse, announced to the world that you were a respectable, civilized, a person of standing. By 1875, an essay in the Architect magazine declared that a bedroom used for anything other than sleeping was unwholesome and immoral. Let me pause on that sentence for a moment, because it is quite something. A bedroom used for anything other than sleeping. For centuries, the bedroom had been a multi-use room, a place to eat, to receive visitors, to conduct business, to sit and talk by the fire. Louis XIV of France had held morning audiences from his bed with the full court present. Before the 19th century, the bedroom was often the most social room in the house. By 1875, it was declared immoral to use it for anything except unconsciousness. This is the Victorian mind at full throttle, and I find it equal parts admirable and slightly alarming. So what did this newly designated, newly sacred Victorian bedroom actually look like? In a well-appointed middle-class household, say a London home in the 1850s or 1860s, The bedroom was arranged with a specific seriousness of purpose. The bed itself was often a four-poster with heavy curtains drawn on all four sides. This was not purely decorative. The curtains served practical functions. They kept out drafts which were genuinely dangerous in cold, damp English houses. They created a small, warm, enclosed space within the larger cold room, and they provided a degree of privacy even within a shared bedroom. Within these curtains, with the cloth drawn around you, you were in a kind of cave separate from the rest of the house, insulated, contained. The position of the bed was a matter of serious household debate. Contemporary advice books and the Victorians produced advice books on absolutely everything recommended that the bed be positioned so it was not directly in line with the door, not exposed to drafts from windows, and not placed where the sleeper's head faced north. There was a genuine belief, drawing on older folk medicine, that sleeping with one's head pointing north aligned the sleeper with the Earth's magnetic field in a harmful way. Gaslighting, which had transformed public streets and commercial spaces, was specifically not recommended for the bedroom. It burned too much oxygen, the advisors warned, and windows were typically kept closed to keep out the coal soot that permeated every waking hour of Victorian urban life. A single candle was the approved light source. The Victorians were adamant about matches in an era before reliable electricity. Being able to find a match in absolute darkness was genuinely important, and household management books fretted at length about where the matches should be kept. One such book, written by an interior decorator named Jane Ellen Panton in 1888, advised housewives that the bedroom should above all be a place of calm, and she recommended with absolute seriousness that every wife equip herself with a long chair in her bedroom where she could rest when overwhelmed by the demands of domestic life. I find that detail unexpectedly touching. The woman who was expected to manage the household invisibly, to be always composed and adequate, being quietly advised, give yourself somewhere to collapse. But here is where the story of the Victorian bedroom takes a sharp and rather dark turn. Because while middle-class households were constructing their private sanctuaries of respectable sleep, something else was happening across town and in the same household in the rooms below stairs where the servants lived. The working-class bedroom, if it existed at all, looked nothing like the domestic ideal. In the overcrowded tenements of Manchester, Liverpool and the East End of London, entire families, 6, 8, 10 people, shared rooms that would have served as a modest closet in a middle-class home. No curtained beds, no long chairs, no careful positioning away from drafts. A straw mattress on the floor or nothing at all, and the warmth of other bodies as the only insulation. And here is the detail that I think most clearly reveals the double standard at the heart of Victorian sleep culture: the babies. In the industrial cities of England, working mothers, women doing factory shifts of 12 or 14 hours, or taking in piecework to be done at home through the night, had a problem that the household management books never addressed. Their infants were awake, and an awake infant was incompatible with the kind of unconscious, obedient productivity that the factory system required. So they drugged them. This is not a euphemism. It was a common, widely available practice. The product was called Godfrey's Cordial, and it was sold without a prescription in every chemist and general store in England. It was a sweet syrup containing laudanum, which is to say, opium dissolved in alcohol. Working mothers gave it to their infants to keep them quiet during the night or when they were left in the care of a baby minder during the working day. The historian's notes on Godfrey's Cordial are matter of fact in a way that is, in retrospect, quietly horrifying. It was noted that the cordial ensured a mother could work the maximum hours of her employment without being disturbed by her infant, and thus increased the family income. Parliamentary debates about restricting opium sales included testimony from Midlands, factory towns describing children who were given so much Godfrey's Cordial that they were, in the language of the time, half stupefied for most of their first years of life. The label on Godfrey's cordial included recommended doses for infants, for children of different ages. It continued to be manufactured and sold until the early 20th century. And what about the adults who could not sleep? Because insomnia, as we saw in our last chapter, was becoming a genuine crisis as the century progressed, a crisis created by the very forces of industrialization that were simultaneously demanding more and better sleep from the people it exhausted. For the wealthy, the prescribed remedy was laudanum as well, though in more respectable doses and with more respectable names. Poets took it. Charles Dickens, who famously suffered from severe insomnia throughout his life, was known to walk the streets of London for hours in the early morning hours trying to tire himself into unconsciousness. Dickens is in fact a fascinating figure in the history of Victorian sleep. He was obsessed with the position of his body in bed. He believed with complete conviction that sleeping with his head pointing north disrupted his rest, and he reportedly carried a compass when travelling to ensure his bed was properly oriented. Every hotel room he stayed in was rearranged. The bed turned. The compass consulted. Whether this helped is not recorded. For those who could not afford Dickens' eccentricities or a physician's prescription, the options were grimmer. In working-class neighbourhoods, gin cheap, widely available, and powerfully sedating served the function that laudanum served for the middle class. The gin shop at the end of the street was as much a sleep aid as a social institution. A few pennies bought unconsciousness that 12 hours of factory work had not quite managed to produce. Chloral hydrate arrived in 1869, the first synthetically produced sedative drug, marketed as a safe and non-addictive alternative to laudanum. It was of course neither safe nor non-addictive. People became dependent on it rapidly. Artists, writers, and fashionable insomniacs embraced it. The painter Dante Gabriel Rossetti became so addicted to it that his biographers traced the deterioration of his health directly to its use. The sleeping body of the Victorian century, it turns out, was never quite as peacefully at rest as the curtained four-poster bed suggested. There is one more dimension of the Victorian bedroom that I want to share because it reveals something that I think is genuinely illuminating about how this century understood the relationship between sleep morality and social order. In wealthy and upper-middle-class households, husbands and wives increasingly slept in separate bedrooms, not because they hated each other necessarily, but because the emerging ideology of respectability in the Victorian era placed enormous emphasis on the appearance of chastity, even within marriage. A husband and wife who maintained their own sleeping quarters demonstrated to the world and to each other that their relationship was properly ordered, rational, contained, governed by the higher faculties rather than the lower ones. In practice, the connecting door between the two rooms was used as needed, but the principle mattered. Here is what strikes me about this arrangement. It is perhaps the most crystalline expression of the central anxiety running through every aspect of the Victorian sleeping world. The fear of the body, the fear of what happens when consciousness retreats and the body is left alone in the dark with its own needs and vulnerabilities. The curtained bed was a defense against draughts and darkness and moral exposure. The private bedroom was a defense against the shared intimacy of communal life. The separate bedrooms for husbands and wives were a defense against the irrationality that the Victorians associated with bodily desire. And the laudanum, the Godfrey's cordial, the gin, the chloral hydrate, those were the last resort when all the other defences had failed, and the body still refused to surrender quietly into the night. The Victorian bedroom tells us in the end not how well this century slept, it often didn't, but how much it feared the act of sleeping, how much vulnerability it contained in the closing of an eye. And when they did finally close their eyes on Sunday mornings, the one morning of the week when the factory whistle did not call, when the children were not yet stirring, when the darkness outside was just beginning to grey at the edges, What did people do? What did the 1800s look like when it finally allowed itself reluctantly, imperfectly to rest? What did ordinary people do with free time when they had any at all? That is exactly the question we are stepping into next. So the Victorian bedroom had been constructed as a sanctuary, curtained private, governed by rules, a place where the messy vulnerabilities of the human body were meant to be managed quietly and alone. And the night, as we saw, was increasingly medicated into submission. But what about the daylight hours that weren't given over to work? What happened when the factory whistle didn't sound, when the counting house was closed, when even the most dedicated Victorian had no choice but to stop? That question, what does an overworked person do with the small amount of time left when the work is done, turned out to be one of the most contested questions of the entire 19th century. And the answers people found were stranger, more complicated, and in some ways more moving than you might expect. Let us begin with the honest reality because it sets the stage for everything else. For most of the first half of the 1800s, for the factory workers and mill girls and coal miners whose lives we have been following through this story, there was essentially no such thing as free time in any meaningful sense. Sundays existed. The Sabbath was legally protected. You could not be required to work on Sunday, at least not officially. Sunday morning meant church, or at least the expectation of church, which was a social obligation carrying real consequences for those who visibly ignored it. Sunday afternoon was technically your own, but Sunday afternoon for a woman who had been on her feet for 72 hours across the previous 6 days was often simply the time when the domestic work that could not be done during the working week finally got done. The laundry that had accumulated, the mending, the cooking that required more than an hour's attention, the floors, the children who had been largely unsupervised all week and required whatever remained of their mother's attention. A historian writing about working-class leisure in early Victorian England found that women in particular were almost entirely absent from the spaces that counted as leisure, the pubs, the sports grounds, the street corners where men gathered on Sunday afternoons. Not because they didn't want to be there, but because the work that was invisible during the week was most visible on the one day that was technically free. And for men, a committee convened in Parliament in 1833 to investigate public spaces for recreation asked a member of Parliament from Blackburn whether there were any places the working children of his town could go to play. His answer, given without embarrassment, was simply none whatsoever. None. In a city of tens of thousands of people after 6 or more decades of industrial growth that had turned fields into factory and commons into private property, there was nowhere left for children to play. But here is where the story becomes genuinely fascinating because the second half of the entry saw something remarkable happen. The leisure that had been squeezed out of ordinary life by the factory system began slowly, imperfectly, with enormous resistance from employers and considerable anxiety from the middle-class reformers who wanted to control what form it took to claw its way back in. And the first thing it reached for was an extremely old friend, the pub. I want to take a moment here to say something about the Victorian pub that does not quite fit the caricature of it as simply a den of drunkenness and despair, because that caricature, though not entirely wrong, misses something important. For working-class men in industrial cities in the 19th century, the pub was often the only warm-lit social space available to them that was not controlled by an employer or a church. You could sit there for the cost of a drink. You could talk. You could hear music. You could be around other people without being watched, evaluated, managed, or told to improve yourself. The pub was for many working men the closest thing to leisure that the city offered. By the 1850s, the more elaborate gin palaces of earlier decades were evolving into music halls, large entertainment venues that combined drink with performances, singers, comedians, acrobats, dancers, magic acts, satirical sketches about the news of the day. By the 1870s, there were music halls seating thousands of people across Britain, some of them extraordinarily elaborate buildings with tiered balconies and ornate decor that rivaled any West End theatre. The music hall is one of the great unsung institutions of Victorian popular culture. It was rowdy, it was sometimes vulgar. The middle-class reformers who believed in rational leisure, the improving kind of free time, the kind spent at lectures and museums and reading groups, regarded it with deep suspicion. But the music hall audiences did not care what the rational leisure advocates thought. They'd been working since before sunrise. They wanted to laugh. And then, in the autumn of 1863, something was born in a tavern in London that would go on to become arguably the most significant leisure institution in the history of the world. On the evening of the 26th of October, representatives of a dozen football clubs met in the Freemasons' Tavern in Holborn to do something that had never quite been done before, agree on a single set of rules. The Football Association was founded that night. Within 6 weeks they had published 13 laws of the game in a small printed booklet cost 1 shilling and sixpence. Football, of course, had been played in England for centuries, the chaotic village-wide mob games where an entire community chased an inflated pig's bladder from one end of a settlement to the other, and which had been periodically prosecuted and periodically banned, and which nobody had managed to actually stop. But the codification of 1863 transformed it into something that could travel, something that could be organised across cities, across counties, across the new railway network that now connected places that had never before met. Within a decade, clubs were forming everywhere, from churches, from factories, from neighbourhoods. Aston Villa, Bolton Wanderers, Tottenham Hotspur. Many of the great English football clubs trace their origins to church groups or factory teams formed in the 1870s and 1880s. The church connection is worth noting. Evangelical Christians who wanted to give working-class men something to do with their time other than drink had hit upon organised sport as a solution. Muscular Christianity, they called it. The idea that a healthy body and a properly occupied Saturday afternoon was good for the soul. The working men of Birmingham and Sheffield and Manchester took to it with rather more enthusiasm than its clerical promoters had perhaps anticipated. By 1872, the FA Cup, the oldest football cup competition in the world, was established. The first final was watched by 2,000 people. Within 20 years, those crowds would grow into the tens of thousands. The game that grew out of working-class English life would within another century become the most watched sport on the planet. But football did not happen in a vacuum. It happened because gradually something unprecedented was beginning to open up a little more time. The Factory Act of 1874 limited the working week to 56.5 hours. Half-day Saturdays began to be granted in many trades, which is why English football matches to this day traditionally kick off at 3 o'clock on Saturday afternoons. That was when the morning shift ended and the men were free. And there was another development, quieter but equally significant, that was beginning to change the geography of free time for ordinary people: the railway. By the 1840s, the British rail network had connected the major industrial cities to the coast. And a remarkable thing began to happen. Working-class families who had never in their lives travelled more than 20 miles from home discovered that for a few shillings they could board a train and be at the sea in a couple of hours. The Victorian seaside excursion was not born for the working class, but the working class claimed it enthusiastically. Towns like Blackpool, Brighton, Scarborough and Margate began attracting enormous weekend crowds from the industrial cities nearby. By 1871, the Bank Holiday Act created fixed public holidays, 4 guaranteed days off per year, and the railway companies responded by laying on cheap excursion trains to coastal destinations. The image of Victorian England is often so industrial, so urban, so grey, the factories and the soot and the crowded tenements, that it is easy to forget that within that same era, a mill worker from Manchester could on a bank holiday find herself standing on a pier at Blackpool with the Irish sea breeze in her face, eating something fried from a paper bag. That experience. That specific, small, improbable experience. The sea air after a week in a cotton mill. I think about it more than is strictly rational. Now here is the part of this story that I find quietly infuriating and quietly wonderful at the same time, because the men in the drawing rooms were not happy about any of this. The debate about how working class people should spend their leisure time was one of the defining cultural anxieties of Victorian England, and it reveals something rather uncomfortable about the century's values. The cockfighting was banned. The bear baiting was banned. The wild, chaotic mob games that had served as the working class's entertainment for centuries were declared uncivilized and gradually suppressed. But here is what a historian named James Walvin pointed out with an accuracy I find difficult to improve upon the same people who banned cockfighting went fox hunting. The same gentleman who declared bear baiting cruel had no problem with stag hunting or shooting parties. The blood sports of the poor were immoral. The blood sports of the rich were tradition. The word for this is hypocrisy. Walvin did not hesitate to use it. The rational leisure movement, earnest well-meaning, full of improving lectures and library membership schemes and temperance pledges, genuinely wanted to help the working class. But it also genuinely believed that working class people could not be trusted to choose their own pleasures responsibly, and needed to have those pleasures curated for them by their betters. This tension between the desire to give working people more free time and the desire to control what they did with it runs like a fault line through the entire late Victorian period, and it never quite resolved itself. What did people actually do when left to their own devices with the small fragments of free time the century had so grudgingly given them? They drank. They went to music halls. They watched football and cricket. They walked to the seaside on bank holidays. They read newspapers. Literacy rates were rising fast in the second half of the century, and the penny press gave working-class readers access to news-serialized fiction and sports reporting. Children in the last decade of the century were reportedly being taught to play by social reformers who found that slum children had so little experience of play that it did not come to them spontaneously. Children had to be taught how to play. That sentence contains in miniature the whole indictment of what the industrial century had done to ordinary life. And yet, and I want to hold this alongside the indictment because it matters, there was something being born in those scrappy Saturday afternoon football matches, those noisy music hall evenings, those chaotic bank holiday trains to Blackpool. A new kind of collective pleasure, a culture of leisure that belonged not to the aristocracy or the church or the reformers, but to the people who had made it for themselves out of whatever time and space the system left them. It was imperfect. It was often loud and sometimes drunk. It did not look like what the rational leisure advocates had in mind, but it was theirs. And here is the question that Part 9 leaves hanging in the air, the one that Part 10 is going to take very seriously. What did leisure look like when you had enough money that you never had to fight for it at all? Because while working-class families were negotiating for a Saturday afternoon or a day at the sea, another class of people was experiencing the 1800s in an entirely different way. People for whom rest was not something you snatched between exhaustion and the next factory whistle. People for whom rest was a philosophy, an institution, an art form practiced with the same seriousness that others brought to their work. And the gap between those two experiences of the same century is in the end one of the sharpest things in all of this history. The mill girl standing on the pier at Blackpool on a bank holiday sea air in her face, fried food in her hand, she had earned that moment, literally. By the mathematics of her week, she had paid for those few hours with approximately 72 other hours of her life. one Saturday afternoon, and a bank holiday. That was what the industrial century at its most generous had offered ordinary working people as their share of the free time that existence had to give. Now, let me introduce you to a different relationship with time entirely. Somewhere in the English countryside on a Thursday afternoon in September, a group of men and women in extraordinarily expensive clothes are sitting on a lawn. A butler has just appeared with a tray. The tea service is silver. The garden stretches to the horizon. Inside the house, which has 40 rooms and has been in the family for 200 years, the billiard room is being set up for the evening. In the morning there will be a shooting party. In 3 days the guests will return to London. This is the country house party. And it is not a weekend in any sense the mill girl would recognise. It runs from Thursday to Monday, sometimes longer. It is simply 4 or 5 days in a sequence of 4 or 5 day visits that constitute the primary social activity of the English aristocracy between the end of the London season in July and the beginning of the hunting season in autumn. This is what rest looked like when you had never in your entire life been required to earn it. Let me give you the architecture of a wealthy Victorian life, because understanding how the very top of the 19th century spent its time illuminates everything about the century's power structure. The English aristocracy, roughly 900 families in 1880, who between them owned about a third of all land in England, organised their year around a remarkably consistent calendar. From May through July, the London season. These were the months when Parliament was sitting, which brought the heads of great families to London for political business. But the season was equally and perhaps primarily a social institution. The approximately 10,000 people who considered themselves part of society, the aristocracy, the titled gentry, the wealthy families who had been received into the right drawing rooms, converged on London for 3 months of dinners, balls, concerts, opera, and the elaborate rituals of social display that were in their own way just as demanding as any other kind of work. Calling cards were left. Invitations were issued and declined and accepted with precise calibration of social meaning. Young women were presented at court, which required special white gowns and the correct number of white feathers in the hair. Marriages were arranged, or rather the conditions for marriages to arrange themselves were carefully constructed, and then the young people were allowed to do the rest. By August, Parliament rose and the season ended. The wealthy dispersed to their country estates, their Scottish shooting lodges, their Alpine hotels, and the country house parties began. I want to dwell on the country house party for a moment because it is one of those Victorian institutions that sounds from the outside like pure indulgence, and is in fact considerably more complicated than that. These gatherings could last anywhere from a long weekend to a week or more. The host and hostess provided absolutely everything: accommodation, food, wine, entertainment, sport. Guests arrived with their own servants, a lady's maid, a valet, which meant that a large party might add 20 or 30 additional people to the household below stairs for the duration. The cost was spectacular. Country house parties of the kind favoured by the Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII, who was famous for his appetite for exactly this kind of extended sociability, were so expensive that some hosts quietly went bankrupt maintaining them. Days had their own rhythm. Mornings were relatively private guests, woke when they chose, took their breakfast in their rooms or downstairs at their leisure, wrote correspondence, went for walks. The household management books of the period describe mornings as a time of private business, which is a charming way of saying that people who had nothing particular to do were free to spend several hours doing it. Afternoons brought the shooting party or the croquet on the lawn, or drives through the estate in open carriages. Evenings were formal dinner lasting several hours with multiple courses and wine chosen to accompany each, followed by cards or music or theatricals. And then on Monday morning everyone went home and the whole machinery began again at the next house. Now here is the question I want to sit with, and I'm curious whether it bothers you the way it bothers me. Was this actually rest? I have been thinking about this for a while, and I keep arriving at the same uncomfortable answer for a significant portion of the people involved, not entirely. The London season in particular was exhausting. The social obligations were relentless. The calculations of status and connection that had to be performed at every dinner and every ball required a constant low-level vigilance that is genuinely tiring. Young women making their debuts in particular were subject to a kind of social performance pressure that modern readers might recognize as rather unpleasant. Every gesture observed, every partner noted, every conversation analysed for what it might indicate about prospects. And for the hostesses of the country house parties, the organisational burden was enormous. The management of 40 guests, their servants, their dietary requirements, their social hierarchies, the seating arrangements at dinner, all of this fell on the lady of the house, coordinated through a hierarchy of domestic staff, but ultimately her responsibility. The wealthy Victorian woman had leisure. She did not have freedom. She had time that was not spent in paid labour, but that time was filled with social obligations almost as rigid as any factory schedule, just cushioned in velvet and silver. But here is where the real story lives, the one that I think justifies this whole detour into country houses and London seasons. Because the true luxury of the Victorian upper class was not the shooting parties, or the opera boxes, or the four-course dinners, remarkable as those were. It was something more fundamental. It was the ability to be unproductive without consequence. Think about what that means. For a factory worker in Manchester in 1850, a day of rest meant a day without wages, which meant a day the rent came closer to unpaid, the children came closer to hungry. Rest had a cost that was immediate and concrete. You could not afford too much of it. For a man with a country estate and income from rents and investments, rest had essentially no cost at all. He could wake at 10. He could spend the morning reading. He could spend the afternoon walking the grounds. He could go to bed at midnight. He could do this every day for weeks, and nothing would change. The rents would still come in. The investments would still return. The American economist Thorstein Veblen, writing at the very end of the 19th century, gave this a name: conspicuous leisure. The point of visible idleness among the wealthy was not simply enjoyment, it was display. The ability to waste time was a signal to the world that you were above the necessity of using it profitably. The aristocrat who shot birds all autumn was not just relaxing. He was demonstrating publicly and continuously that he had no need to do anything else. This is a deeply uncomfortable idea, but I think it is also true, and it explains something that always puzzled me about the Victorian period: why the wealthy were so determined to keep the lower classes from having too much leisure. Because if the possession of leisure was a class marker, if the amount of free time you had signalled your position in the social order, then the prospect of working people having substantial leisure was genuinely threatening, not just economically, but symbolically. A man with a Saturday afternoon to himself was in some small way claiming a dignity that the industrial system had been designed to deny him. But there is another dimension to Victorian leisure that complicates the picture again, and that I want to give its full due because it is in its own way quite wonderful. The 19th century produced the most adventurous leisure class in history. Young men of the English upper classes had been doing the grand tour of Europe since the 17th century, a long journey through France, Switzerland and Italy that was understood as a finishing education, an exposure to art architecture, classical ruins and foreign culture. By the early Victorian era, the railways had made it faster and cheaper, and by mid-century it had become a different beast entirely. In 1841, a former cabinet maker and Baptist lay preacher named Thomas Cook had a thought while walking 15 miles to a temperance meeting in Leicester. What if the new railways could be used to transport ordinary people to extraordinary places? His first excursion took 485 people from Leicester to Loughborough on the 5th of July 1841. They paid 1 shilling each. A band played. Tea was served. It was in hindsight one of the most consequential trips in the history of leisure. Cook built from that beginning with extraordinary energy. By 1851 he had arranged travel to the Great Exhibition in London for over 165,000 people. By 1855 he was running grand circular tours of Belgium, Germany and France. By 1872, Thomas Cook and his son organised the first round-the-world tour, 200 days, nearly 30,000 miles, targeted at wealthy Victorians who wanted to see the world without the inconvenience of organising it themselves. The rich who had always travelled were now travelling with unprecedented organisation and comfort, and the slightly less rich, the emerging middle class of managers, professionals and prosperous tradespeople, were beginning to travel for the first time. The wealthy were not entirely happy about this. Critics complained about Thomas Cook and his excursionists with a venom that makes amusing reading today. The ton, the upper 10,000 of society, did not want their exclusive haunts invaded by school teachers and shop clerks who had booked a package tour. One particularly tart critique described Cook's tourists as uncouth and uneducated common people, descending on the pristine pleasures of the Alps and the Rhine. Thomas Cook, who had grown up poor and had worked since childhood, never quite managed to find acceptance in the upper-class world whose destinations he was democratizing. But his business kept growing anyway, and here is the quiet irony at the heart of all of this, the thing I keep returning to when I think about the Victorian leisure divide. The working-class mill girl with her one bank holiday at Blackpool had something that the lady at the country house party exhausted from the social obligations of the seasons sometimes did not. She had the moment fully. When you have waited for something for a week or a month or a year, when you've carried the weight of constant work against the knowledge that one day eventually you will stand somewhere beautiful and breathe, that moment has a richness that familiarity can never quite replicate. The woman who went to the sea once a year knew what she was feeling and why. She was not performing it. She was not managing it. She was simply inside it. I am not romanticizing poverty. I want to be clear about that. The poverty was real, the exhaustion was real, the injustice was real. But I think there is something true in what I am describing, that the value of rest is not separable from the effort of earning it. That a body which has genuinely worked knows in a way a body that has only performed leisure cannot quite know what it means to stop. And stopping, truly stopping for more than a day, for more than a bank holiday in a way that would restore and renew, rather than simply interrupt the machine that remained out of reach for most working people through most of the 19th century. But not for lack of trying. Because even as the factory masters were calculating how many hours they could extract from a human body before it broke down irreparably, another set of voices was gathering. Voices that had done the arithmetic rather differently. That had looked at the numbers, the 12 hours, the 6 days, the 56-hour week, the children in the mines, the women at the stoves, and concluded clearly and collectively that something fundamental had to change. The story of how they fought for it and what it cost and what they finally won is where we are headed next. And it turns out to be one of the most direct lines between the world of the 1800s and the morning alarm you set last night before you closed your eyes. The alarm on your phone tonight, the notification you set before you climbed into bed, is set for a specific time. Maybe 6:30, maybe 7, maybe even 5:30 if you have an early morning. You probably did not think twice about setting it. It is simply what you do. But I want to tell you where that alarm comes from. Not literally, not the software or the device. I mean the deeper assumption underneath it, the assumption that a human being's working day has a defined end, that your time past a certain hour is yours, that the factory or the office does not own your evenings, your weekends, your sleep. That assumption did not arrive by accident. It was argued for, organised for, marched for, and in some cases died for by people who lived in the very century we've been exploring together, people who got up at 4 a.m. and worked until dark, and understood bone deep what it meant to have nothing left of yourself by the end of the day. The story of how 8 hours became the standard, how 3/8, 8 and 8 and 8 became the rhythm of the modern working life, is one of the most important and least told stories of the 19th century. And it begins of all places in the summer heat of Melbourne, Australia in 1856. Picture a construction site. Melbourne, April of that year. The city is booming, it has been transformed in just a few years by the gold rush, and buildings are going up everywhere. The stonemasons building the law faculty at the new University of Melbourne are working under a relentless Australian sun 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Their leader is a man named James Stephens. He is a veteran of the British Chartist movement, the working-class political campaign that had shaken England in the 1840s before being crushed. He came to Australia partly because Australia felt like a place where new things might be possible. On the 21st of April 1856, James Stephens looked at the sky burning hot even for autumn in Victoria and made a decision. He turned to the men around him and called them to follow. They put down their tools, and they walked. As they moved through the city streets toward Parliament House, stonemasons from other construction sites heard the march and joined it. By the time they arrived, they were a substantial column of working men moving with the specific dignity of people who have decided to take themselves seriously. Their demand was simple. It was also to the ears of their employers and the colonial government revolutionary. 8 hours of work, 8 hours of recreation, 8 hours of rest. That is it. That is the whole thing. The slogan that became the rallying cry of the global labour movement was this simple arithmetic: 24 hours divided into 3 equal parts, none belonging exclusively to the employer. The colonial authorities were rattled. Within days, the government agreed workers on public construction projects would receive the 8-hour day at full pay. No wage cut. Just 8 hours. It was, as labour historians have noted, the first time in the world that a group of workers had won an 8-hour day without a reduction in their wages. The stonemasons celebrated with a banquet and a procession. About 700 people marched. 19 different trades were represented. They became the first known workers in the world to carve their 24 hours into those 3 equal portions and then actually live inside them. The number 888, representing 8 for work, 8 for rest, 8 for recreation, was chiselled above the doorway of the Victorian Trades Hall building when it was constructed. That building still stands. It is the oldest trade union building in the world that is still in active use. Now here is a question worth sitting with for a moment, because I think the answer is revealing. Why did it take until 1856 for anyone to win this? The idea was not new. A Welsh industrialist and social reformer named Robert Owen, a man who managed mills in New Lanark, Scotland, had been proposing the 8-hour day since at least 1817. He coined the very phrase 8 hours labour, 8 hours recreation, 8 hours rest. He was a mill owner himself, which gave his advocacy a particular authority. He argued that shorter hours would make workers healthier, more productive, and more morally sound. The mill owners of England heard him out, and then they continued working their employees for 14 hours a day. The gap between Owen's proposal in 1817 and the Melbourne victory in 1856, nearly 4 decades, tells you everything about what was required to translate a good idea into an actual change in human life. It required people who had nothing to lose by demanding it to organise and refuse to accept anything less. The story moved from Melbourne across the world with remarkable speed, especially to America, where industrial conditions were in many ways even harsher than in England. By the 1860s, labour unions in the United States were calling for national 8-hour legislation. In 1868, Congress actually passed a law establishing an 8-hour day for federal employees, and then promptly refused to enforce it. Employers in the private sector had workers sign waivers of the law as a condition of employment. The law existed on paper and nowhere else. For a decade it mocked the people it was supposed to protect. The frustration built, and on the 1st of May, 1886 it exploded. On that day, which would become International Workers' Day. May Day, the labour holiday celebrated in countries around the world. To this day, an estimated 350,000 workers across the United States went on strike. They marched in cities from New York to Detroit to Milwaukee, singing a song called 8 Hours, whose chorus was ringing across factory district and railroad yards, from one end of the country to the other. The song went 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. In Chicago, 80,000 workers marched up Michigan Avenue on May the 1st in a demonstration that contemporary accounts describe as orderly, purposeful, and genuinely moving. The city had never seen anything like it, but Chicago had also in the weeks before seen a bitter strike at the McCormick Harvester Company, where workers demanding an 8-hour day had been locked out and replaced with workers who would accept the old terms. Tensions between strikers and strike breakers were savage. On May the 3rd, police fired into a crowd outside the McCormick plant. One worker was killed. Several more were injured. The following evening, May the 4th, 1886, a rally was organised in Haymarket Square to protest the police violence. The Chicago mayor himself attended and declared it peaceful. He left early. And then, as the crowd was thinning and the police moved in to disperse the last few hundred people, an unknown person threw a bomb. 7 police officers were killed. Civilian casualties numbered at least 4 dead, possibly more. 60 police officers were wounded. What happened next was a catastrophe for the labour movement, and in the long run one of the foundations on which the modern working day was built. 8 men were arrested and charged with conspiracy, despite the fact that several of them had not even been at the Haymarket rally. The trial was, as one historian put it plainly, one of the most notorious in American legal history. The Chicago Tribune offered to pay jurors if they returned guilty verdicts. 4 of the 8 defendants were executed by hanging. 1 died in prison the night before the scheduled execution, under circumstances that were almost certainly not accidental. These men became known as the Haymarket Martyrs. And here is the thing about martyrdom that power always underestimates: it does not quiet a movement. It gives it something to grieve around, something to march toward. The International Workers' Day that is observed on the 1st of May across most of the world, the holiday that represents labour rights in scores of countries, exists specifically as a memorial to what happened in Haymarket Square in Chicago in 1886. The men who were hanged for demanding an 8-hour workday are why May Day is May Day. The movement ground forward, slowly, imperfectly, with victories that were reversed and then won again, with laws passed and laws ignored and laws finally enforced. In 1914, something unexpected happened. Henry Ford announced that his automobile factories would move to 8-hour shifts. Not because he had been pressured into it by unions. Ford was deeply hostile to unions. But because he discovered something counterintuitive. Workers who were less exhausted made fewer mistakes. Workers who had time to sleep and recover came back the next day more capable of sustaining the relentless pace of the assembly line. Ford also introduced the $5 daily wage at a time when the average auto worker earned about $2.30 for a 9-hour shift. The combination of shorter hours and higher wages was, he calculated, good business. He said with a directness I find genuinely memorable, It is high time to rid ourselves of the notion that leisure for workmen is either lost time or a class privilege. Leisure for workmen is not a class privilege. He was correct, and it had taken the better part of a century and uncountable amounts of human suffering, and at least 4 men hanged in Chicago, and the stonemasons of Melbourne walking off a construction site in the summer heat, for that sentence to be spoken out loud by a man with the economic power to act on it. I want to pause here and say something that feels important to me, something beyond the historical facts. The 8-hour day is often taught as a labour history story, unions, strikes, legislation, dates, and it is all of those things. But underneath the politics and the economics, it is something more fundamental. It is a story about what a human being is worth. The factory system of the early 1800s operated on an implicit assumption that a working person's time had no value except the value assigned to it by an employer, that the hours between finishing work and beginning work again were just a biological necessity, feeding and sleeping the machine of the body so it could return to productivity the next morning. Rest was recovery time for the asset, not life for the person. What the 8-hour movement insisted on, what the stonemasons in Melbourne were really marching for, what the workers in Chicago were really striking for, was a different assumption, that a working person's time is their own, that after they have given their labour what remains belongs to them, not to their employer, that the evening, the weekend, the time before the alarm goes off, that time has intrinsic value, not because it makes you more productive tomorrow, but because it is the only life you have. 8 hours for what we will, that last part. Not 8 hours for what we are permitted, not 8 hours for what keeps us fit for work, 8 hours for what we will, for reading, for walking, for sitting with your children, for lying in a field looking at the sky if that is what you choose, for any small ordinary pleasure that makes a human life feel worth the living of it. And now a question I genuinely want to ask you, if you are still awake enough to consider it. When was the last time you had 8 hours that were truly your own? Not 8 hours of sleep, the body's maintenance time, but 8 waking hours where no obligation existed, no notification demanded your attention, no productivity metric was running somewhere in the back of your mind. I ask because I think many people living in the 21st century have won the 8-hour workday in law and quietly surrendered it in practice. The phone follows us everywhere. The work email arrives at 10 in the evening. The line between labour time and personal time has dissolved so gradually that many of us cannot quite locate where it went. The stonemasons of Melbourne would not be surprised. They understood that winning a right is not the same as keeping it. The 8-hour day was the great unfinished project of the 19th century's labour movement. It passed into law in the United States only in 1938, and even then the fight was far from over. Different countries got there at different times through different struggles with different costs. But the logic was always the same: 24 hours, 3 equal portions each, belonging fully to the person who lives inside them. Work, rest, what we will. And here at the end of this long century we have been wandering through together after the factories and the mines and the women at their coal stoves and the children in the dark tunnels and the Tolpuddle martyrs under their sycamore tree and the stonemasons marching in Melbourne and the bomb in Haymarket Square. We arrive at a question that the 1800s asked and every generation since has had to answer for itself. What are we actually owed? Not by our employers, not by the law, but by the nature of things. What does a human life require at minimum to be something more than a mechanism? The 19th century found one answer, imperfect, hard won, still contested, but an answer. The world the 1800s built is still the world we live in, and what it teaches us about ourselves, about time and labour and rest, and what it means to be human in a century that measures everything, is where we are going to end this story. Stay with me, we are almost there. We've travelled a long way tonight, from the craftsman in his pre-industrial workshop setting his own hours and taking Monday off because nobody could stop him, through the factory bell at 4:30 in the morning and the children in the dark tunnels and the women bent over coal stoves before sunrise, through the Victorian bedroom with its curtained bed and its laudanum bottles, through the quiet revolutionary idea that 8 hours of each day might belong to the person living inside them. We've been in a lot of different centuries tonight, and somehow without quite intending to, we've arrived here. At this question, what did the 1800s actually do to you? Not to people in general, to you specifically right now lying there in the dark. Let me tell you something that I find almost uncomfortably direct. The alarm clock on your bedside table or your phone, which is essentially the same thing, is a direct descendant of a device invented in 1787 by a New Hampshire clockmaker named Levi Hutchins. He made it, as far as history can tell, purely to wake himself up for work. He wanted a mechanical guarantee of punctuality that his own biology could not reliably provide. His clock could only ring at one fixed time, 4:30 in the morning. He built into a piece of brass and springs and gears the assumption that a human body's natural inclination to sleep when tired was a problem to be solved, not a rhythm to be respected. That assumption that the body is a machine that needs to be overridden in service of productivity is one of the deepest legacies of the century we have just spent the night exploring. And nearly 2.5 centuries later, most of us are still living inside it. Here is something that I think deserves to be said plainly because it is one of the more striking facts about the modern world. We are by most measures sleeping less than at almost any previous point in recorded history. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the United States reports that roughly 1 in 3 American adults does not get sufficient sleep regularly. Over the last 5 decades, the average sleep duration has decreased by approximately 2 hours per night. The proportion of people sleeping fewer than 6 hours has increased by about 6% since 1985 alone. We built the 8-hour workday. We won it painfully over the course of a century. And then we filled the hours outside it with work emails and notifications, and the particular anxiety of a world that never quite turns off. The author Ben Rice, who wrote A History of Sleep in America, described it concisely. The Industrial Revolution created a sleep is for wimps attitude, and that attitude has never fully left us. We glamorize exhaustion. We congratulate each other for being busy. We treat the need for rest as a personal failing, something to overcome, as if the body that requires 8 hours of unconsciousness every night is somehow less serious than the body that claims to function on 5. What would the craftsman of 1750 with his Saint Monday and his 3 meal breaks and his work that stopped when it was too dark to see? What would he make of the professional in 2025 who apologizes for leaving the office at 6 o'clock? But here is the thing I want to end with, and it is the thing that has stayed with me most through all of this research. The 1800s, that messy, brutal, extraordinary century, did something to human life that was genuinely new. It created the concept of rest as a right, not rest as a biological necessity that you snatch between exhaustion and the next obligation, not rest as a luxury available only to those with inherited wealth, not rest as something God allows you on Sunday if you've been sufficiently pious, rest as something every working person deserves by virtue simply of being a person. That idea did not exist in the world before the Industrial Revolution, in the same way it existed after it. The workers who marched in Melbourne with their 888 slogan were not just asking for shorter shifts. They were making a philosophical argument about the nature of human time, that a day has 3 equal portions, and that 2 of those 3 portions belong irrevocably to the person living through it. That is not a labour demand. That is a statement about what a human life is worth. Think about the distance travelled. In 1800, a cotton mill worker in Manchester had no legal right to any particular number of the hours of rest. No right to any day off. No right to a minimum wage. No right to refuse work on the grounds that it was dangerous. No right to form an organisation that might collectively negotiate for better conditions. By 1900, many of those rights existed imperfectly, unevenly, constantly contested and partially reversed. But they existed. They had names. They had laws behind them. They had the weight of organised collective action. The week you experience the Monday, the Friday, the Saturday morning, the Sunday afternoon is not a natural feature of human existence. It is an invention. A hard-won, specific, historically recent invention, built by people whose names we mostly do not know, who never expected to be remembered, who marched and organised and wrote petitions and sometimes went to prison and occasionally died. They did it so that you could have a weekend, and a Friday evening, and 8 hours that belong genuinely and legally to what you will. Now I want to offer you a small thought to carry into sleep tonight, and I say this not as a conclusion to a history lesson, but as something I genuinely mean. The fact that you are here resting in the dark at this hour is not a trivial thing. Every previous generation that lived through the industrial century had to fight in ways large and small for the right to exactly this. To lie down when tired, to let the work wait until morning, to exist for a few hours outside the economy. There is a paragraph in an 1825 medical journal that Roger E. Kirch found giving advice to parents about children's sleep habits. The journal told parents that if a child woke in the middle of the night and was tempted to take a second nap, they should be taught to look upon it as an intemperance not at all redounding to their credit. Sleeping in 1825 was being taught to children as something that could reflect badly on your moral character if you did too much of it. We have not fully escaped that inheritance. The culture of productivity, of visible busyness as a social virtue, runs through the modern world with the same relentlessness that the factory bell ran through the Victorian one. We just carry it in our pockets now instead of hearing it from a tower across town. But in this matters we know more than the Victorians did. We know about the watch, the old midnight, waking the hour that used to belong to prayer and quiet conversation and checking the fire. We know that our bodies have a memory older than the Industrial Revolution, older than the alarm clock, older than the concept of a working week. We know that the anxiety some of us feel lying awake at 2 a.m. is not a disorder. It is, in Roger E. Kirch's precise and quietly stunning phrase, a powerful remnant or echo of this long dominant pattern. Your body remembers something the 1800s tried to make it forget. So here is the question the whole century leaves us with. Not a homework question, just something to think about as your eyes grow heavy. If the 1800s taught the world that time is finite, and therefore valuable, if that century through all its cruelty and brilliance and contradiction forced humanity to reckon with what human time is actually worth. What does it mean to spend yours well, not productively, not efficiently, not in ways that can be measured or optimized or reported in a quarterly review, but well, in the old-fashioned sense, with the awareness that you are a person in a century occupying a brief portion of the only life you've been given, and that how you rest is part of how you live. The factory workers of Manchester knew something about this that we've half forgotten. The stonemasons of Melbourne knew it. The woman with her one bank holiday at the sea knew it, with a sharpness that familiarity has eroded in us. Rest is not what you do when the work is finished. Rest is part of what it means to be alive. We've come a long way together tonight from the very first world before the clock owned anyone's time all the way through to the moment right now, where you're lying in the dark and the world outside is quiet. Across these hours we've spent together, I've had the pleasure of thinking through this story with you. The children in the mines, the 2 sleeps, the sycamore tree in Tolpuddle, the factory bell at 4:30, the stonemasons who simply put down their tools and walked. All of it pointing somehow toward this, the ordinary, extraordinary fact of being a person who is allowed to rest. Thank you for spending this night here with me. Thank you for being curious about the world that built the one you live in. And if you wake somewhere between midnight and 3 calm and still without any particular reason, do not fight it. Do not panic. Do not reach for the phone to check the time. Just lie there for a moment. Let the watch be what it always was, a quiet hour that belongs entirely and irrevocably to you. Sleep well. I will be here when you come back.